Part 5, Chapter 1 of Crime and Punishment by Fyodor Dostoyevsky. The morning that followed the fateful interview with Donia and her mother brought sobering influences to bear on Pyotr Petrovitch. Intensely unpleasant as it was, he was forced little by little to accept as a fact beyond recall what had seemed to him only the day before fantastic and incredible. The black snake of wounded vanity had been gnawing at his heart all night. When he got out of bed, Pyotr Petrovitch immediately looked in the looking-glass. He was afraid that he had jaundice. However, his health seemed unimpaired so far, and looking at his noble, clear-skinned countenance, which had grown fattish of late, Pyotr Petrovitch for an instant was positively comforted in the conviction that he would find another bride, and perhaps even a better one. But coming back to the sense of his present position, he turned aside and spat vigorously, which excited a sarcastic smile in Andrei Semyonovitch Lebeziatnikov, the young friend with whom he was staying. That smile Pyotr Petrovitch noticed, and at once set it down against his young friend's account. He had set down a good many points against him of late. His anger was redoubled when he reflected that he ought not to have told Andrei Semyonovitch about the result of yesterday's interview. That was the second mistake he had made in temper, through impulsiveness and irritability. Moreover, all that morning one unpleasantness followed another. He even found a hitch awaiting him in his legal case in the Senate. He was particularly irritated by the owner of the flat, which had been taken in view of his approaching marriage, and was being redecorated at his own expense. The owner, a rich German tradesman, would not entertain the idea of breaking the contract which had just been signed, and insisted on the full forfeit money, though Pyotr Petrovitch would be giving him back the flat practically redecorated. In the same way, the upholsterers refused to return a single rouble of the installment paid for the furniture purchased but not yet removed to the flat. "Am I to get married simply for the sake of the furniture?" Pyotr Petrovitch ground his teeth, and at the same time, once more he had a gleam of desperate hope. "Can all that be really so irrevocably over? Is it no use to make another effort?" The thought of Donia sent a voluptuous pang through his heart. He endured anguish at that moment, and if it had been possible to slay Raskolnikov instantly by wishing it, Pyotr Petrovitch would promptly have uttered the wish. "It was my mistake, too, not to have given them money," he thought, as he returned dejectedly to Lebeziatnikov's room. "And why on earth was I such a Jew? It was false economy. I meant to keep them without a penny so that they should turn to me as their providence, and look at them. Phoo! If I'd spent some 1,500 roubles on them for the trousseau and presents, on knickknacks, dressing-cases, jewelry, materials, and all that sort of trash from Knopf's and the English shop, my position would have been better, and stronger. They could not have refused me so easily. They are the sort of people that would feel bound to return money and presents if they broke it off, and they would find it hard to do. And their conscience would prick them. How can we dismiss a man who has hitherto been so generous and delicate? I've made a blunder." And grinding his teeth again, Pyotr Petrovitch called himself a fool, but not aloud, of course. He returned home, twice as irritated and angry as before. The preparations for the funeral dinner at Katerina Ivanovna's excited his curiosity as he passed. He had heard about it the day before. He fancied, indeed, that he had been invited, but absorbed in his own cares, he had paid no attention. Inquiring of Madame Lepevechel, who was busy laying the table while Katerina Ivanovna was away at the cemetery, he heard that the entertainment was to be a great affair, that all the lodgers had been invited, among them some who had not known the dead man, that even Andrei Semyonovitch Lebeziatnikov was invited in spite of his previous quarrel with Katerina Ivanovna, that he, Pyotr Petrovitch, was not only invited, but was eagerly expected as he was the most important of the lodgers. Amalia Ivanovna herself had been invited with great ceremony in spite of the recent unpleasantness, and so she was very busy with preparations and was taking a positive pleasure in them. She was, moreover, dressed up to the nines, all in new black silk, and she was proud of it. All this suggested an idea to Pyotr Petrovitch as he went into his room, or rather Lebeziatnikov's, somewhat thoughtful. He had learnt that Raskolnikov was to be one of the guests. Andrei Semyonovitch had been at home all the morning. The attitude of Pyotr Petrovitch to this gentleman was strange, though perhaps natural. Pyotr Petrovitch had despised and hated him from the day he came to stay with him, and at the same time he seemed somewhat afraid of him. He had not come to stay with him on his arrival in Petersburg simply from parsimony, though that had been perhaps his chief object. He had heard of Andrei Semyonovitch, who had once been his ward, as a leading young progressive who was taking an important part in certain interesting circles, the doings of which were a legend in the provinces. It had impressed Pyotr Petrovitch. These powerful, omniscient circles, who despised everyone and showed everyone up, had long inspired in him a peculiar but quite vague alarm. He had not, of course, been able to form even an approximate notion of what they meant. He, like everyone, had heard that there were, especially in Petersburg, progressives of some sort, nihilists and so on, and, like many people, he exaggerated and distorted the significance of those words to an absurd degree. What for many years past he had feared more than anything was being shown up, and this was the chief ground for his continual uneasiness at the thought of transferring his business to Petersburg. He was afraid of this as little children are sometimes panic-stricken. Some years before, when he was just entering on his own career, he had come upon 2 cases in which rather important personages in the province, patrons of his, had been cruelly shown up. One instance had ended in great scandal for the person attacked, and the other had very nearly ended in serious trouble. For this reason, Pyotr Petrovitch intended to go into the subject as soon as they reached Petersburg, and, if necessary, to anticipate contingencies by seeking the favor of our younger generation. He relied on Andrei Semyonovitch for this, and before his visit to Raskolnikov he had succeeded in picking up some current phrases. He soon discovered that Andrei Semyonovitch was a commonplace simpleton, but that by no means reassured Pyotr Petrovitch. Even if he had been certain that all the progressives were fools like him, it would not have allayed his uneasiness. All the doctrines, the ideas, the systems with which Andrei Semyonovitch pestered him had no interest for him. He had his own object. He simply wanted to find out at once what was happening here. Had these people any power or not? Had he anything to fear from them? Would they expose any enterprise of his? And what precisely was now the object of their attacks? Could he somehow make up to them and get round them if they really were powerful? Was this the thing to do or not? Couldn't he gain something through them? In fact, hundreds of questions presented themselves. Andrei Semyonovitch was an anemic, scrofulous little man, with strangely flaxen, mutton-chop whiskers, of which he was very proud. He was a clerk, and had almost always something wrong with his eyes. He was rather soft-hearted, but self-confident, and sometimes extremely conceited in speech, which had an absurd effect, incongruous with his little figure. He was one of the lodgers most respected by Amalia Ivanovna, for he did not get drunk and paid regularly for his lodgings. Andrei Semyonovitch really was rather stupid. He attached himself to the cause of progress and our younger generation from enthusiasm. He was one of the numerous and varied legion of dullards, of half-animate abortions, conceited, half-educated coxcombs, who attach themselves to the idea most in fashion, only to vulgarize it, and who caricature every cause they serve, however sincerely. Though Lebeziatnikov was so good-natured, he too was beginning to dislike Pyotr Petrovitch. This happened on both sides unconsciously. However simple Andrei Semyonovitch might be, he began to see that Pyotr Petrovitch was duping him and secretly despising him, and that he was not the right sort of man. He had tried expounding to him the system of Fourier and the Darwinian theory, but of late Pyotr Petrovitch began to listen too sarcastically and even to be rude. The fact was, he had begun instinctively to guess that Lebeziatnikov was not merely a commonplace simpleton, but perhaps a liar too, and that he had no connections of any consequence even in his own circle, but had simply picked things up third hand, and that very likely he did not even know much about his own work of propaganda, for he was in too great a muddle. A fine person he would be to show anyone up. It must be noted, by the way, that Pyotr Petrovitch had during those 10 days eagerly accepted the strangest praise from Andrei Semyonovitch. He had not protested, for instance, when Andrei Semyonovitch belauded him for being ready to contribute to the establishment of a new commune, or to abstain from christening his future children, or to acquiesce if Donia were to take a lover a month after marriage, and so on. Pyotr Petrovitch so enjoyed hearing his own praises that he did not disdain even such virtues when they were attributed to him. Pyotr Petrovitch had had occasion that morning to realize some 5% bonds, and now he sat down to the table and counted over bundles of notes. Andrei Semyonovitch, who hardly ever had any money, walked about the room pretending to himself to look at all those bank-notes with indifference and even contempt. Nothing would have convinced Pyotr Petrovitch that Andrei Semyonovitch could really look on the money unmoved, and the latter, on his side, kept thinking bitterly that Pyotr Petrovitch was capable of entertaining such an idea about him, and was perhaps glad of the opportunity of teasing his young friend by reminding him of his inferiority and the great difference between them. He found him incredibly inattentive and irritable, though he, Andrei Semyonovitch, began enlarging on his favorite subject, the foundation of a new special commune. The brief remarks that dropped from Pyotr Petrovitch between the clicking of the beads on the reckoning frame betrayed unmistakable and discourteous irony. But the humane Andrei Semyonovitch ascribed Pyotr Petrovitch's ill-humor to his recent breach with Donia, and he was burning with impatience to discourse on that theme. He had something progressive to say on the subject, which might console his worthy friend and could not fail to promote his development. "There is some sort of festivity being prepared at the widow's, isn't there?" Pyotr Petrovitch asked suddenly, interrupting Andrei Semyonovitch at the most interesting passage. "Why, don't you know? Why, I was telling you last night what I think about all such ceremonies. And she invited you too, I heard. You were talking to her yesterday." "I should never have expected that beggarly fool would have spent on this feast all the money she got from that other fool Raskolnikov. I was surprised just now as I came through at the preparations there, the wines. Several people are invited. It's beyond everything," continued Pyotr Petrovitch, who seemed to have some object in pursuing the conversation. "What? You say I am asked too? When was that? I don't remember. But I shan't go. Why should I? I only said a word to her in passing yesterday of the possibility of her obtaining a year's salary as a destitute widow of a government clerk. I suppose she has invited me on that account, hasn't she? Heh heh heh." "I don't intend to go either," said Lebeziatnikov. "I should think not, after giving her a thrashing. You might well hesitate. Heh heh." "Who thrashed? Whom?" cried Lebeziatnikov, flustered and blushing. "Why, you thrashed Katerina Ivanovna a month ago. I heard so yesterday. So that's what your convictions amount to. And the woman question, too, wasn't quite sound. Heh heh heh." And Pyotr Petrovitch, as though comforted, went back to clicking his beads. "It's all slander and nonsense," cried Lebeziatnikov, who was always afraid of allusions to the subject. "It was not like that at all. It was quite different. You've heard it wrong. It's a libel. I was simply defending myself. She rushed at me first with her nails. She pulled out all my whiskers. It's permissible for anyone, I should hope, to defend himself, and I never allow anyone to use violence to me on principle, for it's an act of despotism. What was I to do? I simply pushed her back." "Heh heh heh," Luzhin went on, laughing maliciously. "You keep on like that because you are out of humor yourself. But that's nonsense, and it has nothing whatever to do with the woman question. You don't understand. I used to think, indeed, that if women are equal to men in all respects, even in strength, as is maintained now, there ought to be equality in that too. Of course, I reflected afterwards that such a question ought not really to arise, for there ought not to be fighting, and in the future society fighting is unthinkable, and that it would be a queer thing to seek for equality in fighting. I am not so stupid. Though, of course, there is fighting. There won't be later, but at present there is. Confound it. How muddled one gets with you. It's not on that account that I am not going. I am not going on principle, not to take part in the revolting convention of memorial dinners, that's why. Though, of course, one might go to laugh at it. I am sorry there won't be any priests at it. I should certainly go if there were. Then you would sit down at another man's table and insult it and those who invited you, eh? Certainly not insult, but protest. I should do it with a good object. I might indirectly assist the cause of enlightenment and propaganda. It's a duty of every man to work for enlightenment and propaganda, and the more harshly, perhaps, the better. I might drop a seed, an idea, and something might grow up from that seed. How should I be insulting them? They might be offended at first, but afterwards they'd see I'd done them a service. You know, Terebieva, who is in the community now, was blamed because when she left her family and devoted herself, she wrote to her father and mother that she wouldn't go on living conventionally and was entering on a free marriage, and it was said that that was too harsh, that she might have spared them and have written more kindly. I think that's all nonsense, and there's no need of softness. On the contrary, what's wanted is protest. Varents had been married 7 years. She abandoned her 2 children. She told her husband straight out in a letter, "I have realized that I cannot be happy with you. I can never forgive you that you have deceived me by concealing from me that there is another organization of society by means of the communities. I have only lately learnt it from a great-hearted man to whom I have given myself, and with whom I am establishing a community. I speak plainly because I consider it dishonest to deceive you. Do as you think best. Do not hope to get me back. You are too late. I hope you will be happy." That's how letters like that ought to be written. Is that Terebieva the one you said had made a 3rd free marriage? No, it's only the 2nd, really. But what if it were the 4th? What if it were the 15th? That's all nonsense. And if ever I regretted the death of my father and mother, it is now, and I sometimes think if my parents were living, what a protest I would have aimed at them. I would have done something on purpose. I would have shown them. I would have astonished them. I am really sorry there is no one. To surprise, Well, be that as you will, Pyotr Petrovitch interrupted. But tell me this. Do you know the dead man's daughter, the delicate-looking little thing? It's true what they say about her, isn't it? What of it? I think, that is, it is my own personal conviction that this is the normal condition of women. Why not? I mean, distinguons. In our present society, it is not altogether normal, because it is compulsory. But in the future society, it will be perfectly normal, because it will be voluntary. Even as it is, she was quite right. She was suffering, and that was her asset, so to speak, her capital, which she had a perfect right to dispose of. Of course, in the future society, there will be no need of assets, but her part will have another significance, rational and in harmony with her environment. As to Sofya Semyonovna personally, I regard her action as a vigorous protest against the organization of society, and I respect her deeply for it. I rejoice indeed when I look at her. I was told that you got her turned out of these lodgings. Lebeziatnikov was enraged. That's another slander, he yelled. It was not so at all. That was all Katerina Ivanovna's invention, for she did not understand. And I never made love to Sofya Semyonovna. I was simply developing her, entirely disinterestedly, trying to rouse her to protest. All I wanted was her protest, and Sofya Semyonovna could not have remained here anyway. Have you asked her to join your community? You keep on laughing, and very inappropriately, allow me to tell you. You don't understand. There is no such role in a community. The community is established that there should be no such roles. In a community, such a role is essentially transformed, and what is stupid here is sensible there. What, under present conditions, is unnatural becomes perfectly natural in the community. It all depends on the environment. It's all the environment, and man himself is nothing. And I am on good terms with Sofya Semyonovna to this day, which is a proof that she never regarded me as having wronged her. I am trying now to attract her to the community, but on quite a different footing. What are you laughing at? We are trying to establish a community of our own, a special one, on a broader basis. We have gone further in our convictions. We reject more. And meanwhile, I'm still developing Sofya Semyonovna. She has a beautiful, beautiful character. And you take advantage of her fine character, eh? Heh heh. No, no, oh no, on the contrary. Oh, on the contrary, a queer thing to say. Believe me, why should I disguise it? In fact, I feel it strange myself how timid, chaste, and modern she is with me. And you, of course, are developing her, trying to prove to her that all that modesty is nonsense? Not at all, not at all. How coarsely, how stupidly, excuse me saying so, you misunderstand the word development. Good heavens, how crude you still are. We are striving for the freedom of women, and you have only one idea in your head. Setting aside the general question of chastity and feminine modesty as useless in themselves, and indeed prejudices, I fully accept her chastity with me, because that's for her to decide. Of course, if she were to tell me herself that she wanted me, I should think myself very lucky, because I like the girl very much. But as it is, no one has ever treated her more courteously than I, with more respect for her dignity. I wait in hopes, that's all. You had much better make her a present of something. I bet you never thought of that. You don't understand, as I've told you already. Of course she is in such a position, but it's another question. Quite another question. You simply despise her. Seeing a fact which you mistakenly consider deserving of contempt, you refuse to take a humane view of a fellow creature. You don't know what a character she is. I am only sorry that of late she has quite given up reading and borrowing books. I used to lend them to her. I am sorry, too, that, with all the energy and resolution in protesting, which she has already shown once, she has little self-reliance, little, so to say, independence, so as to break free from certain prejudices and certain foolish ideas. Yet she thoroughly understands some questions, for instance, about kissing of hands, that is, that it's an insult to a woman for a man to kiss her hand, because it's a sign of inequality. We had a debate about it, and I described it to her. She listened attentively to an account of the workmen's associations in France, too. Now I am explaining the question of coming into the room in the future society. And what's that, pray? We had a debate lately on the question, has a member of the community the right to enter another member's room, whether man or woman, at any time? And we decided that he has. It might be at an inconvenient moment, Lebeziatnikov was really angry. You are always thinking of something unpleasant, he cried with aversion. Phoo! How vexed I am that, when I was expounding our system, I referred prematurely to the question of personal privacy. It's always a stumbling block to people like you. They turn it into ridicule before they understand it. And how proud they are of it, too. Phoo! I've often maintained that that question should not be approached by a novice till he has a firm faith in the system. And tell me, please, what do you find so shameful even in cesspools? I should be the first to be ready to clean out any cesspool you like. And it's not a question of self-sacrifice, it's simply work, honorable, useful work, which is as good as any other and much better than the work of a Raphael and a Pushkin, because it is more useful. And more honorable, What do you mean by more honorable? I don't understand such expressions to describe human activity. More honorable, nobler, all those are old-fashioned prejudices which I reject. Everything which is of use to mankind is honorable. I only understand one word, useful. You can snigger as much as you like, but that's so." Pyotr Petrovitch laughed heartily. He had finished counting the money and was putting it away. But some of the notes he left on the table. The cesspool question had already been a subject of dispute between them. What was absurd was that it made Lebeziatnikov really angry, while it amused Luzhin, and at that moment he particularly wanted to anger his young friend. "It's your ill luck yesterday that makes you so ill-humoured and annoying," blurted out Lebeziatnikov, who, in spite of his independence and his protests, did not venture to oppose Pyotr Petrovitch, and still behaved to him with some of the respect habitual in earlier years. "You'd better tell me this," Pyotr Petrovitch interrupted with haughty displeasure. "Can you, or rather, are you really friendly enough with that young person to ask her to step in here for a minute? I think they've all come back from the cemetery. I heard the sound of steps. I want to see her, that young person." "What for?" Lebeziatnikov asked with surprise. "Oh, I want to. I am leaving here today or tomorrow, and therefore I wanted to speak to her about— However, you may be present during the interview. It's better you should be, indeed. For there's no knowing what you might imagine." "I shan't imagine anything. I only asked, and if you've anything to say to her, nothing is easier than to call her in. I'll go directly, and you may be sure I won't be in your way." 5 minutes later, Lebeziatnikov came in with Sonia. She came in very much surprised and overcome with shyness as usual. She was always shy in such circumstances, and was always afraid of new people. She had been as a child, and was even more so now. Pyotr Petrovitch met her politely and affably, but with a certain shade of bantering familiarity which, in his opinion, was suitable for a man of his respectability and weight in dealing with a creature so young and so interesting as she. He hastened to reassure her, and made her sit down facing him at the table. Sonia sat down, looked about her, at Lebeziatnikov, at the notes lying on the table, and then again at Pyotr Petrovitch, and her eyes remained riveted on him. Lebeziatnikov was moving to the door. Pyotr Petrovitch signed to Sonia to remain seated, and stopped Lebeziatnikov. "Is Raskolnikov in there? Has he come?" he asked him in a whisper. "Raskolnikov? Yes. Why? Yes, he is there. I saw him just come in. Why?" "Well, I particularly beg you to remain here with us, and not to leave me alone with this young woman. I only want a few words with her, but God knows what they may make of it. I shouldn't like Raskolnikov to repeat anything. You understand what I mean?" "I understand." Lebeziatnikov saw the point. "Yes, you are right. Of course, I am convinced personally that you have no reason to be uneasy, but still you are right. Certainly I'll stay. I'll stand at the window and not be in your way." "I think you are right." Pyotr Petrovitch returned to the sofa, sat down opposite Sonia, looked attentively at her, and assumed an extremely dignified, even severe expression, as much as to say, "Don't you make any mistake, madam." Sonia was overwhelmed with embarrassment. "In the first place, Sofya Semyonovna, will you make my excuses to your respected mamma? That's right, isn't it? Katerina Ivanovna stands in the place of a mother to you." Pyotr Petrovitch began with great dignity, although affably. It was evident that his intentions were friendly. "Quite so, yes, the place of a mother," Sonia answered, timidly and hurriedly. "Then will you make my apologies to her? Through inevitable circumstances, I am forced to be absent, and shall not be at the dinner, in spite of your mamma's kind invitation." "Yes, I'll tell her, at once." And Sonia hastily jumped up from her seat. "Wait, that's not all." Pyotr Petrovitch detained her, smiling at her simplicity and ignorance of good manners. "And you know me little, my dear Sofya Semyonovna, if you suppose I would have ventured to trouble a person like you for a matter of so little consequence affecting myself only. I have another object." Sonia sat down hurriedly. Her eyes rested again for an instant on the grey and rainbow-coloured notes that remained on the table, but she quickly looked away and fixed her eyes on Pyotr Petrovitch. She felt it horribly indecorous, especially for her, to look at another person's money. She stared at the gold eyeglass which Pyotr Petrovitch held in his left hand, and at the massive and extremely handsome ring with a yellow stone on his middle finger. But suddenly she looked away, and, not knowing where to turn, ended by staring Pyotr Petrovitch again straight in the face. After a pause of still greater dignity, he continued. "I chanced yesterday in passing to exchange a couple of words with Katerina Ivanovna, poor woman. That was sufficient to enable me to ascertain that she is in a position, preternatural, if one may so express it." "Yes, preternatural," Sonia hurriedly assented. "Or it would be simpler and more comprehensible to say ill." "Yes, simpler and more yes, ill." "Quite so. So then, from a feeling of humanity, and so to speak compassion, I should be glad to be of service to her in any way, foreseeing her unfortunate position. I believe the whole of this poverty-stricken family depends now entirely on you." "Allow me to ask." Sonia rose to her feet. "Did you say something to her yesterday of the possibility of a pension? Because she told me you had undertaken to get her one. Was that true?" "Not in the slightest, and indeed it's an absurdity. I merely hinted at her obtaining temporary assistance as the widow of an official who had died in the service, if only she has patronage. But apparently your late parent had not served his full term, and had not indeed been in the service at all of late. In fact, if there could be any hope, it would be very ephemeral, because there would be no claim for assistance in that case, far from it. And she is dreaming of a pension already. Go ahead, lady." "Yes, she is. For she is credulous and good-hearted, and she believes everything from the goodness of her heart, and she is like that. Yes, you must excuse her," said Sonia, and again she got up to go. "But you haven't heard what I have to say." "No, I haven't heard," muttered Sonia. "Then sit down." She was terribly confused. She sat down again a third time. "Seeing her position with her unfortunate little ones, I should be glad, as I have said before, so far as lies in my power, to be of service. That is, so far as is in my power, not more. One might, for instance, get up a subscription for her, or a lottery, something of the sort, such as is always arranged in such cases by friends, or even outsiders, desirous of assisting people. It was of that I intended to speak to you. It might be done." "Yes, yes, God will repay you for it," faltered Sonia, gazing intently at Pyotr Petrovitch. "It might be, but we will talk of it later. We might begin it today. We will talk it over this evening, and lay the foundation, so to speak. Come to me at 7 o'clock. Mr. Lebeziatnikov, I hope, will assist us. But there is one circumstance of which I ought to warn you beforehand, and for which I venture to trouble you, Sofia Semyonovna, to come here. In my opinion, money cannot be, indeed it's unsafe to put it into Katerina Ivanovna's own hands. The dinner today is a proof of that. Though she has not, so to speak, a crust of bread for tomorrow, and, well, boots or shoes or anything, she has bought today Jamaica rum, and even, I believe, Madeira, and coffee. I saw it as I passed through. Tomorrow it will all fall upon you again. They won't have a crust of bread. It's absurd, really, and so, to my thinking, a subscription ought to be raised so that the unhappy widow should not know of the money, but only you, for instance. Am I right?" "I don't know. This is only today, once in her life. She was anxious to do honor, to celebrate the memory, and she is very sensible. But just as you think, and I shall be very, they will all be, and God will reward, and the orphans—" Sonia burst into tears. "Very well, then, keep it in mind. And now will you accept for the benefit of your relation the small sum that I am able to spare, from me personally? I am very anxious that my name should not be mentioned in connection with it. Here, having, so to speak, anxieties of my own, I cannot do more." And Pyotr Petrovitch held out to Sonia a 10-ruble note, carefully unfolded. Sonia took it, flushed crimson, jumped up, muttered something, and began taking leave. Pyotr Petrovitch accompanied her ceremoniously to the door. She got out of the room at last, agitated and distressed, and returned to Katerina Ivanovna, overwhelmed with confusion. All this time Lebeziatnikov had stood at the window or walked about the room, anxious not to interrupt the conversation. When Sonia had gone, he walked up to Pyotr Petrovitch and solemnly held out his hand. "I heard and saw everything," he said, laying stress on the last verb. "That is honorable. I mean to say, it's humane. You wanted to avoid gratitude, I saw. And although I cannot, I confess, in principle, sympathize with private charity, for it not only fails to eradicate the evil, but even promotes it, yet I must admit that I saw your action with pleasure. Yes, I like it." "That's all nonsense," muttered Pyotr Petrovitch, somewhat disconcerted, looking carefully at Lebeziatnikov. "No, it's not nonsense. A man who has suffered distress and annoyance as you did yesterday, and who yet can sympathize with the misery of others, such a man, even though he is making a social mistake, is still deserving of respect. I did not expect it indeed of you, Pyotr Petrovitch, especially as according to your ideas— Oh, what a drawback your ideas are to you! How distressed you are, for instance, by your ill luck yesterday!" cried the simple-hearted Lebeziatnikov, who felt a return of affection for Pyotr Petrovitch. "And what do you want with marriage, with legal marriage, my dear, noble Pyotr Petrovitch? Why do you cling to this legality of marriage? Well, you may beat me if you like, but I am glad, positively glad, it hasn't come off, that you are free, that you are not quite lost for humanity. You see, I've spoken my mind. Because I don't want in your free marriage to be made a fool of, and to bring up another man's children. That's why I want legal marriage," Luzhin replied in order to make some answer. He seemed preoccupied by something. "Children? You referred to children." Lebeziatnikov started off like a war-horse at the trumpet call. "Children are a social question, and a question of first importance, I agree. But the question of children has another solution. Some refuse to have children altogether, because they suggest the institution of the family. We'll speak of children later, but now as to the question of honor, I confess that's my weak point. That horrid, military, Pushkin expression is unthinkable in the dictionary of the future. What does it mean indeed? It's nonsense. There will be no deception in a free marriage. That is only the natural consequence of a legal marriage, so to say, its correction, a protest. So that indeed it's not humiliating. And if I ever, to suppose an absurdity, were to be legally married, I should be positively glad of it. I should say to my wife, 'My dear, hitherto I have loved you. Now I respect you, for you've shown you can protest.' You laugh. That's because you're incapable of getting away from prejudices. Confound it all! I understand now where the unpleasantness is of being deceived in a legal marriage, but it's simply a despicable consequence of a despicable position in which both are humiliated. When the deception is open, as in a free marriage, then it does not exist. It's unthinkable. Your wife will only prove how she respects you by considering you incapable of opposing her happiness and avenging yourself on her for her new husband. Damn it all! I sometimes dream if I were to be married. Phoo! I mean, if I were to be married, legally or not, it's just the same. I should present my wife with a lover, if she had not found one herself. 'My dear,' I should say, 'I love you, but even more than that, I desire you to respect me. See? Am I not right?'" Pyotr Petrovitch sniggered as he listened, but without much merriment. He hardly heard it indeed. He was preoccupied with something else, and even Lebeziatnikov at last noticed it. Pyotr Petrovitch seemed excited and rubbed his hands. Lebeziatnikov remembered all this and reflected upon it afterwards. End of Part 5, Chapter 1. Part 5, Chapter 2. It would be difficult to explain exactly what could have originated the idea of that senseless dinner in Katerina Ivanovna's disordered brain. Nearly 10 of the 20 rubles given by Raskolnikov for Marmeladov's funeral were wasted upon it. Possibly Katerina Ivanovna felt obliged to honor the memory of the deceased suitably, that all the lodgers, and still more Amalia Ivanovna, might know that he was in no way their inferior, and perhaps very much their superior, and that no one had the right to turn up his nose at him. Perhaps the chief element was that peculiar poor man's pride, which compels many poor people to spend their last savings on some traditional social ceremony, simply in order to do like other people, and not to be looked down upon. It is very probable, too, that Katerina Ivanovna longed on this occasion, at the moment when she seemed to be abandoned by everyone, to show those wretched contemptible lodgers that she knew how to do things, how to entertain, and that she had been brought up in a genteel, she might almost say aristocratic colonel's family, and had not been meant for sweeping floors and washing the children's rags at night. Even the poorest and most broken-spirited people are sometimes liable to these paroxysms of pride and vanity, which take the form of an irresistible nervous craving. And Katerina Ivanovna was not broken-spirited. She might have been killed by circumstance, but her spirit could not have been broken. That is, she could not have been humiliated, her will could not be crushed. Moreover, Sonia had said with good reason that her mind was unhinged. She could not be said to be insane, but for a year past she had been so harassed that her mind might well be overstrained. The later stages of consumption are apt, doctors tell us, to affect the intellect. There was no great variety of wines, nor was there Madeira, but wine there was. There was vodka, rum, and Lisbon wine, all of the poorest quality, but in sufficient quantity. Besides the traditional rice and honey, there were 3 or 4 dishes, one of which consisted of pancakes, all prepared in Amalia Ivanovna's kitchen. 2 samovars were boiling, that tea and punch might be offered after dinner. Katerina Ivanovna had herself seen to purchasing the provisions, with the help of one of the lodgers, an unfortunate little Pole who had somehow been stranded at Madame Lepeveshel's. He promptly put himself at Katerina Ivanovna's disposal, and had been all that morning and all the day before, running about as fast as his legs could carry him, and very anxious that everyone should be aware of it. For every trifle he ran to Katerina Ivanovna, even hunting her out at the bazaar, at every instant called her Pani. She was heartily sick of him before the end, though she had declared at first that she could not have got on without this serviceable and magnanimous man. It was one of Katerina Ivanovna's characteristics to paint everyone she met in the most glowing colors. Her praises were so exaggerated as sometimes to be embarrassing. She would invent various circumstances to the credit of her new acquaintance, and quite genuinely believe in their reality. Then, all of a sudden, she would be disillusioned, and would rudely and contemptuously repulse the person she had only a few hours before been literally adoring. She was naturally of a gay, lively, and peace-loving disposition, but from continual failures and misfortunes she had come to desire so keenly that all should live in peace and joy and should not dare to break the peace, that the slightest jar, the smallest disaster, reduced her almost to frenzy, and she would pass in an instant from the brightest hopes and fancies to cursing her fate and raving, and knocking her head against the wall. Amalia Ivanovna, too, suddenly acquired extraordinary importance in Katerina Ivanovna's eyes, and was treated by her with extraordinary respect, probably only because Amalia Ivanovna had thrown herself heart and soul into the preparations. She had undertaken to lay the table, to provide the linen, crockery, etc., and to cook the dishes in her kitchen, and Katerina Ivanovna had left it all in her hands and gone herself to the cemetery. Everything had been well done. Even the tablecloth was nearly clean. The crockery, knives, forks, and glasses were, of course, of all shapes and patterns, lent by different lodgers, but the table was properly laid at the time fixed, and Amalia Ivanovna, feeling she had done her work well, had put on a black silk dress and a cap with new mourning ribbons, and met the returning party with some pride. This pride, though justifiable, displeased Katerina Ivanovna for some reason. As though the table could not have been laid except by Amalia Ivanovna! She disliked the cap with the new ribbons, too. Could she be stuck up, the stupid German, because she was a mistress of the house and had consented as a favor to help her poor lodgers? As a favor! Fancy that! Katerina Ivanovna's father, who had been a colonel and almost a governor, had sometimes had the table set for 40 persons, and then anyone like Amalia Ivanovna, or rather Ludwigovna, would not have been allowed into the kitchen. Katerina Ivanovna, however, put off expressing her feelings for the time, and contented herself with treating her coldly, though she decided inwardly that she would certainly have to put Amalia Ivanovna down and set her in her proper place, for goodness only knew what she was fancying herself. Katerina Ivanovna was irritated, too, by the fact that hardly any of the lodgers invited had come to the funeral, except the Pole, who had just managed to run into the cemetery, while to the memorial dinner the poorest and most insignificant of them had turned up, the wretched creatures, many of them not quite sober. The older and more respectable of them all, as if by common consent, stayed away. Pyotr Petrovitch Luzhin, for instance, who might be said to be the most respectable of all the lodgers, did not appear, though Katerina Ivanovna had the evening before told all the world, that is, Amalia Ivanovna, Polenka, Sonia, and the Pole, that he was the most generous, noble-hearted man with a large property and vast connections, who had been a friend of her first husband's and a guest in her father's house, and that he had promised to use all his influence to secure her a considerable pension. It must be noted that when Katerina Ivanovna exalted anyone's connections and fortune, it was without any ulterior motive, quite disinterestedly, for the mere pleasure of adding to the consequence of the person praised. Probably, taking his cue from Luzhin, that contemptible wretch Lebeziatnikov had not turned up either. What did he fancy himself? He was only asked out of kindness and because he was sharing the same room with Pyotr Petrovitch and was a friend of his, so that it would have been awkward not to invite him. Among those who failed to appear were the genteel lady and her old maidish daughter, who had only been lodgers in the house for the past fortnight, but had several times complained of the noise and uproar in Katerina Ivanovna's room, especially when Marmeladov had come back drunk. Katerina Ivanovna heard this from Amalia Ivanovna, who, quarrelling with Katerina Ivanovna and threatening to turn the whole family out of doors, had shouted at her that they were not worth the foot of the honourable lodgers whom they were disturbing. Katerina Ivanovna determined now to invite this lady and her daughter, whose foot she was not worth, and who had turned away haughtily when she casually met them, so that they might know that she was more noble in her thoughts and feelings and did not harbour malice, and might see that she was not accustomed to her way of living. She had proposed to make this clear to them at dinner with allusions to her late father's governorship, and also at the same time to hint that it was exceedingly stupid of them to turn away on meeting her. The fat colonel-major, he was really a discharged officer of low rank, was also absent, but it appeared that he had been not himself for the last 2 days. The party consisted of the Pole, a wretched-looking clerk with a spotty face and a greasy coat, who had not a word to say for himself, and smelt abominably, a deaf and almost blind old man who had once been in the post-office, and who had been from immemorial ages maintained by someone at Amalia Ivanovna's. A retired clerk of the commissariat department came too. He was drunk, had a loud and most unseemly laugh, and only fancy was without a waistcoat. One of the visitors sat straight down to the table without even greeting Katerina Ivanovna. Finally, one person having no suit appeared in his dressing-gown, but this was too much, and the efforts of Amalia Ivanovna and the Pole succeeded in removing him. The Pole brought with him, however, 2 other Poles who did not live at Amalia Ivanovna's, and whom no one had seen here before. All this irritated Katerina Ivanovna intensely. For whom had they made all these preparations, then? To make room for the visitors, the children had not even been laid for at the table, but the 2 little ones were sitting on a bench in the furthest corner with their dinner laid on a box, while Polenka, as a big girl, had to look after them, feed them, and keep their noses wiped like well-bred children's. Katerina Ivanovna, in fact, could hardly help meeting her guests with increased dignity, and even haughtiness. She stared at some of them with special severity, and loftily invited them to take their seats. Rushing to the conclusion that Amalia Ivanovna must be responsible for those who were absent, she began treating her with extreme nonchalance, which the latter promptly observed and resented. Such a beginning was no good omen for the end. All were seated at last. Raskolnikov came in almost at the moment of their return from the cemetery. Katerina Ivanovna was greatly delighted to see him. In the first place, because he was the one educated visitor, and, as everyone knew, was in 2 years to take a professorship in the university. And secondly, because he immediately and respectfully apologized for having been unable to be at the funeral. She positively pounced upon him, and made him sit on her left hand. Amalia Ivanovna was on her right. In spite of her continual anxiety that the dishes should be passed round correctly and that everyone should taste them, in spite of the agonizing cough which interrupted her every minute, and seemed to have grown worse during the last few days, she hastened to pour out in a half-whisper to Raskolnikov all her suppressed feelings and her just indignation at the failure of the dinner, interspersing her remarks with lively and uncontrollable laughter at the expense of her visitors, and especially of her landlady. "It's all that cuckoo's fault. You know whom I mean? Her. Katerina Ivanovna nodded towards the landlady. "Look at her. She's making round eyes. She feels that we are talking about her and can't understand. Phoo, the owl. Ha ha! Cough, cough, cough. And what does she put on that cap for? Cough, cough, cough. Have you noticed that she wants everyone to consider that she is patronizing me and doing me an honor by being here? I asked her like a sensible woman to invite people, especially those who knew my late husband, and look at the set of fools she has brought. The sweeps. Look at that one with the spotty face. And those wretched Poles. Ha ha ha. Cough, cough, cough. Not one of them has ever poked his nose in here. I've never set eyes on them. What have they come here for, I ask you? There they sit in a row. Hey, Pan! She cried suddenly to one of them. Have you tasted the pancakes? Take some more. Have some beer. Won't you have some vodka? Look, he's jumped up and is making his bows. They must be quite starved, poor things. Never mind, let them eat. They don't make a noise anyway, though I'm really afraid for our landlady's silver spoons. Amalia Ivanovna, she addressed her suddenly, almost aloud, if your spoon should happen to be stolen, I won't be responsible, I warn you. Ha ha ha! She laughed, turning to Raskolnikov, and again nodding towards the landlady, in high glee at her sally. She didn't understand. She didn't understand again. Look how she sits with her mouth open. An owl, a real owl. An owl in new ribbons. Ha ha ha! Here her laugh turned again to an insufferable fit of coughing that lasted 5 minutes. Drops of perspiration stood out on her forehead, and her handkerchief was stained with blood. She showed Raskolnikov the blood in silence, and, as soon as she could get her breath, began whispering to him again with extreme animation and a hectic flush on her cheeks. Do you know, I gave her the most delicate instructions, so to speak, for inviting that lady and her daughter. You understand of whom I am speaking. It needed the utmost delicacy, the greatest nicety, but she has managed things so that that fool, that conceited baggage, that provincial nonentity, simply because she is the widow of a major, and has come to try and get a pension and to fray out her skirts in the government offices, because at 50 she paints her face, everybody knows it. A creature like that did not think fit to come, and has not even answered the invitation, which the most ordinary good manners required. Can't understand why Pyotr Petrovitch has not come. But where's Sonia? Where has she gone? Ah, there she is at last. What is it, Sonia? Where have you been? It's odd that even at your father's funeral you should be so unpunctual. Rodion Romanovitch, make room for her beside you. That's your place, Sonia. Take what you like. Have some of the cold entree with jelly, that's the best. They'll bring the pancakes directly. Have they given the children some? Polenka, have you got everything? Cough, cough, cough. That's all right. Be a good girl, Lida, and Kolya, don't fidget with your feet. Sit like a little gentleman. What are you saying, Sonia? Sonia hastened to give her Pyotr Petrovitch's apologies, trying to speak loud enough for everyone to hear and carefully choosing the most respectful phrases which she attributed to Pyotr Petrovitch. She added that Pyotr Petrovitch had particularly told her to say that, as soon as he possibly could, he would come immediately to discuss business alone with her, and to consider what could be done for her, etc., etc. Sonia knew that this would comfort Katerina Ivanovna, would flatter her and gratify her pride. She sat down beside Raskolnikov. She made him a hurried bow, glancing curiously at him. But for the rest of the time she seemed to avoid looking at him or speaking to him. She seemed absent-minded, though she kept looking at Katerina Ivanovna, trying to please her. Neither she nor Katerina Ivanovna had been able to get mourning. Sonia was wearing dark brown, and Katerina Ivanovna had on her only dress, a dark striped cotton one. The message from Pyotr Petrovitch was very successful. Listening to Sonia with dignity, Katerina Ivanovna inquired with equal dignity how Pyotr Petrovitch was, then at once whispered almost aloud to Raskolnikov that it certainly would have been strange for a man of Pyotr Petrovitch's position and standing to find himself in such extraordinary company, in spite of his devotion to her family and his old friendship with her father. "That's why I'm so grateful to you, Rodion Romanovitch, that you have not disdained my hospitality even in such surroundings," she added almost aloud. "But I am sure that it was only your special affection for my poor husband that has made you keep your promise." Then once more with pride and dignity she scanned her visitors, and suddenly inquired aloud across the table of the deaf man, "Wouldn't he have some more meat, and had he been given some wine?" The old man made no answer, and for a long while could not understand what he was asked, though his neighbours amused themselves by poking and shaking him. He simply gazed about him with his mouth open, which only increased the general mirth. "What an imbecile! Look, look! Why was he brought? But as to Pyotr Petrovitch, I always had confidence in him," Katerina Ivanovna continued. "And, of course, he is not like—" With an extremely stern face, she addressed Amalia Ivanovna so sharply and loudly that the latter was quite disconcerted. "Not like your dressed-up draggle-tails, whom my father would not have taken as cooks into his kitchen, and my late husband would have done them honour if he had invited them in the goodness of his heart." "Yes, he was fond of drink, he was fond of it, he did drink," cried the commissariat clerk, gulping down his 12th glass of vodka. "My late husband certainly had that weakness, and everyone knows it." Katerina Ivanovna attacked him at once. "But he was a kind and honourable man, who loved and respected his family. The worst of it was his good nature made him trust all sorts of disreputable people, and he drank with fellows who were not worth the sole of his shoe. Would you believe it, Rodion Romanovitch, they found a gingerbread cock in his pocket. He was dead drunk, but he did not forget the children." "A cock? Did you say a cock?" shouted the commissariat clerk. Katerina Ivanovna did not vouchsafe a reply. She sighed, lost in thought. "No doubt you think, like everyone, that I was too severe with him," she went on, addressing Raskolnikov. "But that's not so. He respected me very much. He was a kind-hearted man. And how sorry I was for him sometimes. He would sit in a corner and look at me. I used to feel so sorry for him, I used to want to be kind to him, and then would think to myself, 'Be kind to him, and he will drink again.' It was only by severity that you could keep him within bounds." "Yes, he used to get his hair pulled pretty often," roared the commissariat clerk again, swallowing another glass of vodka. "Some fools would be better for a good drubbing, as well as having their hair pulled. I am not talking of my late husband now," Katerina Ivanovna snapped at him. The flush on her cheeks grew more and more marked, her chest heaved. In another minute she would have been ready to make a scene. Many of the visitors were sniggering, evidently delighted. They began poking the commissariat clerk and whispering something to him. They were evidently trying to egg him on. "Allow me to ask what you are alluding to," began the clerk. "That is to say, about whom, did you say just now? But I don't care. That's nonsense. "Widow, I forgive you. Pass." And he took another drink of vodka. Raskolnikov sat in silence, listening with disgust. He only ate from politeness, just tasting the food that Katerina Ivanovna was continually putting on his plate, to avoid hurting her feelings. He watched Sonia intently, but Sonia became more and more anxious and distressed. She too foresaw that the dinner would not end peaceably, and saw with terror Katerina Ivanovna's growing irritation. She knew that she, Sonia, was the chief reason for the genteel lady's contemptuous treatment of Katerina Ivanovna's invitation. She had heard from Amalia Ivanovna that the mother was positively offended at the invitation, and had asked the question, how could she let her daughter sit down beside that young person? Sonia had a feeling that Katerina Ivanovna had already heard this, and an insult to Sonia meant more to Katerina Ivanovna than an insult to herself, her children, or her father. Sonia knew that Katerina Ivanovna would not be satisfied now till she had shown those draggle-tails that they were both. To make matters worse, someone passed Sonia, from the other end of the table, a plate with 2 hearts pierced with an arrow, cut out of black bread. Katerina Ivanovna flushed crimson, and at once said aloud across the table that the man who sent it was a drunken ass. Amalia Ivanovna was foreseeing something amiss, and at the same time deeply wounded by Katerina Ivanovna's haughtiness, and to restore the good humour of the company and raise herself in their esteem, she began, apropos of nothing, telling a story about an acquaintance of hers, Karl from the chemist's, who was driving one night in a cab, and that the cabman wanted to kill, and Karl very much begged him not to kill, and wept and clasped hands, and frightened and from fear pierced his heart. Though Katerina Ivanovna smiled, she observed at once that Amalia Ivanovna ought not to tell anecdotes in Russian. The latter was still more offended, and she retorted that Vater aus Berlin was a very important man, and always went with his hands in pockets. Katerina Ivanovna could not restrain herself, and laughed so much that Amalia Ivanovna lost patience and could scarcely control herself. "Listen to the owl," Katerina Ivanovna whispered at once, her good humour almost restored. "She meant to say he kept his hands in his pockets, but she said he put his hands in people's pockets. Cough, cough. And have you noticed, Rodion Romanovitch, that all these Petersburg foreigners, the Germans especially, are all stupider than we? Can you fancy any one of us telling how Karl from the chemist's pierced his heart from fear, and that the idiot, instead of punishing the cabman, clasped his hands and wept and much begged? Ah, the fool! And you know she fancies it's very touching, and does not suspect how stupid she is. To my thinking, that drunken commissariat clerk is a great deal cleverer. Anyone can see that he has addled his brains with drink. But you know, these foreigners are always so well-behaved and serious. Look how she sits glaring. She is angry, ha-ha. Cough, cough, cough." Regaining her good humour, Katerina Ivanovna began at once telling Raskolnikov that when she had obtained her pension, she intended to open a school for the daughters of gentlemen in her native town, T. This was the first time she had spoken to him of the project, and she launched out into the most alluring details. It suddenly appeared that Katerina Ivanovna had in her hands the very certificate of honour of which Marmeladov had spoken to Raskolnikov in the tavern, when he told him that Katerina Ivanovna, his wife, had danced the chawl dance before the governor and other great personages on leaving school. This certificate of honour was obviously intended now to prove Katerina Ivanovna's right to open a boarding school, but she had armed herself with it chiefly with the object of overwhelming those 2 stuck-up draggle-tails if they came to the dinner, and proving incontestably that Katerina Ivanovna was of the most noble, she might even say aristocratic family, a colonel's daughter, and was far superior to certain adventuresses who have been so much to the fore of late. The certificate of honour immediately passed into the hands of the drunken guests, and Katerina Ivanovna did not try to retain it, for it actually contained the statement en toutes lettres that her father was of the rank of a major, and also a companion of an order, so that she really was almost the daughter of a colonel. Warming up, Katerina Ivanovna proceeded to enlarge on the peaceful and happy life they would lead in T, on the gymnasium teachers whom she would engage to give lessons in her boarding school, one a most respectable old Frenchman, one Mangot, who had taught Katerina Ivanovna herself in old days and was still living in T, and would no doubt teach in her school on moderate terms. Next she spoke of Sonia, who would go with her to T, and help her in all her plans. At this, someone at the further end of the table gave a sudden guffaw. Though Katerina Ivanovna tried to appear to be disdainfully unaware of it, she raised her voice and began at once speaking with conviction of Sonia's undoubted ability to assist her, of her greatness, patience, devotion, generosity, and good education, tapping Sonia on the cheek and kissing her warmly twice. Sonia flushed crimson, and Katerina Ivanovna suddenly burst into tears, immediately observing that she was nervous and silly, that she was too much upset, that it was time to finish, and as the dinner was over, it was time to hand round the tea. At that moment, Amalia Ivanovna, deeply aggrieved at taking no part in the conversation, and not being listened to, made one last effort, and with secret misgivings ventured on an exceedingly deep and weighty observation, that, in the future boarding school, she would have to pay particular attention to Divasha, and that there certainly must be a good dama to look after the linen, and secondly, that the young ladies must not novels at night read. Katerina Ivanovna, who certainly was upset and very tired, as well as heartily sick of the dinner, at once cut short Amalia Ivanovna, saying she knew nothing about it and was talking nonsense, that it was the business of the laundry-maid, and not of the directress of a high-class boarding school to look after Divasha, and as for novel-reading, that was simply rudeness, and she begged her to be silent. Amalia Ivanovna, fired up and getting very angry, observed that she only meant her good, and that she had meant her very good, and that it was long since she had paid her gold for the lodgings. Katerina Ivanovna at once set her down, saying that it was a lie to say she wished her good, because only yesterday, when her dead husband was lying on the table, she had worried her about the lodgings. To this Amalia Ivanovna very appropriately observed that she had invited those ladies, but those ladies had not come, because those ladies are ladies, and cannot come to a lady who is not a lady. Katerina Ivanovna at once pointed out to her that, as she was a slut, she could not judge what made one really a lady. Amalia Ivanovna at once declared that her Vater aus Berlin was a very, very important man, and both hands in pockets went, and always used to say, "Poof, poof," and she leapt up from the table to represent her father, sticking her hands in her pockets, puffing her cheeks, and uttering vague sounds resembling "poof, poof," amid loud laughter from all the lodgers, who purposely encouraged Amalia Ivanovna, hoping for a fight. But this was too much for Katerina Ivanovna, and she at once declared, so that all could hear, that Amalia Ivanovna probably never had a father, but was simply a drunken Petersburg Finn, and had certainly once been a cook, and probably something worse. Amalia Ivanovna turned as red as a lobster, and squealed that perhaps Katerina Ivanovna never had a father, but she had a Vater aus Berlin, and that he wore a long coat, and always said, "Poof, poof, poof." Katerina Ivanovna observed contemptuously that all knew what her family was, and that on that very certificate of honor it was stated in print that her father was a colonel, while Amalia Ivanovna's father, if she really had one, was probably some Finnish milkman, but that probably she never had a father at all, since it was still uncertain whether her name was Amalia Ivanovna or Amalia Ludwigovna. At this Amalia Ivanovna lashed to fury, struck the table with her fist, and shrieked that she was Amalia Ivanovna and not Ludwigovna, that her father was named Johann, and that he was a burgomeister, and that Katerina Ivanovna's father was quite never a burgomeister. Katerina Ivanovna rose from her chair, and with a stern and apparently calm voice, though she was pale and her chest was heaving, observed that if she dared for one moment to set her contemptible wretch of a father on a level with her papa, she, Katerina Ivanovna, would tear her cap off her head and trample it underfoot. Amalia Ivanovna ran about the room, shouting at the top of her voice that she was mistress of the house, and that Katerina Ivanovna should leave the lodgings that minute. Then she rushed for some reason to collect the silver spoons from the table. There was a great outcry and uproar. The children began crying. Sonia ran to restrain Katerina Ivanovna. But when Amalia Ivanovna shouted something about the yellow ticket, Katerina Ivanovna pushed Sonia away and rushed at the landlady to carry out her threat. At that minute the door opened, and Pyotr Petrovitch Luzhin appeared on the threshold. He stood scanning the party with severe and vigilant eyes. Katerina Ivanovna rushed to him. End of Part 5, Chapter 2. Part 5, Chapter 3. "Pyotr Petrovitch," she cried, "protect me, you at least. Make this foolish woman understand that she can't behave like this to a lady in misfortune, that there is a law for such things. I'll go to the Governor-General himself. She shall answer for it. Remembering my father's hospitality, protect these orphans." "Allow me, madam, allow me." Pyotr Petrovitch waved her off. "Your papa, as you are well aware, I had not the honor of knowing." Someone laughed aloud. "And I do not intend to take part in your everlasting squabbles with Amalia Ivanovna. I have come here to speak of my own affairs, and I want to have a word with your stepdaughter, Sofia. Ivanovna, I think it is. Allow me to pass." Pyotr Petrovitch, edging by her, went to the opposite corner where Sonia was. Katerina Ivanovna remained standing where she was, as though thunderstruck. She could not understand how Pyotr Petrovitch could deny having enjoyed her father's hospitality. Though she had invented it herself, she believed in it firmly by this time. She was struck too by the businesslike, dry, and even contemptuous menacing tone of Pyotr Petrovitch. All the clamour gradually died away at his entrance. Not only was this serious businessman strikingly incongruous with the rest of the party, but it was evident, too, that he had come upon some matter of consequence, that some exceptional cause must have brought him, and that, therefore, something was going to happen. Raskolnikov, standing beside Sonia, moved aside to let him pass. Pyotr Petrovitch did not seem to notice him. A minute later Lebeziatnikov, too, appeared in the doorway. He did not come in, but stood still, listening with marked interest, almost wonder, and seemed for a time perplexed. "Excuse me for possibly interrupting you, but it's a matter of some importance," Pyotr Petrovitch observed, addressing the company generally. "I am glad indeed to find other persons present. Amalia Ivanovna, I humbly beg you as mistress of the house to pay careful attention to what I have to say to Sofia Ivanovna. Sofia Ivanovna," he went on, addressing Sonia, who was very much surprised and already alarmed, "immediately after your visit I found that 100-rouble note was missing from my table, in the room of my friend Mr. Lebeziatnikov. If in any way whatever you know and will tell us where it is now, I assure you on my word of honor, and call all present to witness, that the matter shall end here. In the opposite case, I shall be compelled to have recourse to very serious measures, and then you must blame yourself." Complete silence reigned in the room. Even the crying children were still. Sonia stood deadly pale, staring at Luzhin and unable to say a word. She seemed not to understand. Some seconds passed. "Well, how is it to be, then?" asked Luzhin, looking intently at her. "I don't know. I know nothing about it," Sonia articulated faintly at last. "No, you know nothing?" Luzhin repeated, and again he paused for some seconds. "Think a moment, mademoiselle," he began severely, but still, as it were, admonishing her. "Reflect. I am prepared to give you time for consideration. Kindly observe this. If I were not so entirely convinced, I should not, you may be sure, with my experience, venture to accuse you so directly. Seeing that, for such direct accusation before witnesses, if false or even mistaken, I should myself, in a certain sense, be made responsible, I am aware of that. This morning I changed for my own purposes several 5% securities for the sum of approximately 3,000 roubles. The account is noted down in my pocket-book. On my return home, I proceeded to count the money, as Mr. Lebeziatnikov will bear witness, and after counting 2,300 roubles, I put the rest in my pocket-book in my coat-pocket. About 500 rubles remained on the table, and among them 3 notes of 100 rubles each. At that moment you entered, at my invitation, and all the time you were present you were exceedingly embarrassed, so that 3 times you jumped up in the middle of the conversation and tried to make off. Mr. Lebeziatnikov can bear witness to this. You yourself, mademoiselle, probably will not refuse to confirm my statement that I invited you through Mr. Lebeziatnikov solely in order to discuss with you the hopeless and destitute position of your relative, Katerina Ivanovna, whose dinner I was unable to attend, and the advisability of getting up something of the nature of a subscription, lottery or the like, for her benefit. You thanked me, and even shed tears. I describe all this as it took place, primarily to recall it to your mind, and secondly, to show you that not the slightest detail has escaped my recollection. Then I took a 10-ruble note from the table and handed it to you by way of first installment on my part for the benefit of your relative. Mr. Lebeziatnikov saw all this. Then I accompanied you to the door, you being still in the same state of embarrassment, after which, being left alone with Mr. Lebeziatnikov, I talked to him for 10 minutes. Then Mr. Lebeziatnikov went out, and I returned to the table, with the money lying on it, intending to count it and to put it aside, as I proposed doing before. To my surprise, 100-ruble note had disappeared. Kindly consider the position. Mr. Lebeziatnikov I cannot suspect. I am ashamed to allude to such a supposition. I cannot have made a mistake in my reckoning, for the minute before your entrance I had finished my accounts and found the total correct. You will admit that, recollecting your embarrassment, your eagerness to get away, and the fact that you kept your hands for some time on the table, and taking into consideration your social position and the habits associated with it, I was, so to say, with horror and positively against my will, compelled to entertain a suspicion, a cruel but justifiable suspicion. I will add further and repeat that in spite of my positive conviction, I realize that I run a certain risk in making this accusation, but, as you see, I could not let it pass. I have taken action, and I will tell you why. Solely, madam, solely owing to your black ingratitude. Why, I invite you for the benefit of your destitute relative. I present you with my donation of 10 rubles, and you, on the spot, repay me for all that with such an action. It is too bad. You need a lesson. Reflect. Moreover, like a true friend, I beg you, and you could have no better friend at this moment, think what you are doing. Otherwise, I shall be immovable. Well, what do you say?" "I have taken nothing," Sonia whispered in terror. "You gave me 10 rubles. Here it is. Take it." Sonia pulled her handkerchief out of her pocket, untied a corner of it, took out the 10-ruble note, and gave it to Luzhin. "And the 100 rubles you do not confess to taking?" he insisted reproachfully, not taking the note. Sonia looked about her. All were looking at her with such awful, stern, ironical, hostile eyes. She looked at Raskolnikov. He stood against the wall, with his arms crossed, looking at her with glowing eyes. "Good God!" broke from Sonia. "Amalia Ivanovna, we shall have to send word to the police, and therefore I humbly beg you meanwhile to send for the house porter," Luzhin said softly and even kindly. "Gott der Barmherzige! I knew she was the thief!" cried Amalia Ivanovna, throwing up her hands. "You knew it?" Luzhin caught her up. "Then I suppose you had some reason before this for thinking so. I beg you, worthy Amalia Ivanovna, to remember your words which have been uttered before witnesses." There was a buzz of loud conversation on all sides. All were in movement. "What?" cried Katerina Ivanovna, suddenly realizing the position, and she rushed at Luzhin. "What? You accuse her of stealing? Sonia? Ah, the wretches! The wretches!" And running to Sonia, she flung her wasted arms round her and held her as in a vice. "Sonia, how dare you take 10 rubles from him? Foolish girl! Give it to me. Give me the 10 rubles at once. Here." And snatching the note from Sonia, Katerina Ivanovna crumpled it up and flung it straight into Luzhin's face. It hit him in the eye and fell on the ground. Amalia Ivanovna hastened to pick it up. Pyotr Petrovitch lost his temper. "Hold that mad woman!" he shouted. At that moment several other persons, besides Lebeziatnikov, appeared in the doorway, among them the two ladies. "What? Mad? I am mad? Idiot!" shrieked Katerina Ivanovna. "You are an idiot yourself, pettifogging lawyer, base man! Sonia, take his money. Sonia, a thief! Why, she'd give away her last penny!" And Katerina Ivanovna broke into hysterical laughter. "Did you ever see such an idiot?" She turned from side to side. "And you too?" She suddenly saw the landlady. "And you too, sausage-eater, you declare that she is a thief, you trashy Prussian hensleg in a crinoline? She hasn't been out of this room. She came straight from you, you wretch, and sat down beside me. Everyone saw her. She sat here, by Rodion Romanovitch. Search her. Since she's not left the room, the money would have to be on her. Search her, search her! But if you don't find it, then excuse me, my dear fellow, you'll answer for it. I'll go to our sovereign, to our gracious Tsar himself, and throw myself at his feet, today, this minute. I am alone in the world. They would let me in. Do you think they wouldn't? You're wrong. I will get in. I will get in. You reckoned on her meekness. You relied upon that. But I am not so submissive, let me tell you. You've gone too far yourself. Search her, search her!" And Katerina Ivanovna, in a frenzy, shook Luzhin and dragged him towards Sonia. "I am ready. I'll be responsible. But calm yourself, madam, calm yourself. I see that you are not so submissive." Well, but as to that," Luzhin muttered, "that ought to be before the police, though, indeed, there are witnesses enough as it is. I am ready. But in any case it's difficult for a man, on account of her sex. But with the help of Amalia Ivanovna, though, of course, it's not the way to do things. How is it to be done?" "As you will. Let anyone who likes search her," cried Katerina Ivanovna. "Sonia, turn out your pockets. See? Look, monster, the pocket is empty. Here was her handkerchief. Here is the other pocket. Look! Do you see? Do you see?" And Katerina Ivanovna turned, or rather snatched, both pockets inside out. But from the right pocket a piece of paper flew out, and describing a parabola in the air, fell at Luzhin's feet. Everyone saw it. Several cried out. Pyotr Petrovitch stooped down, picked up the paper in 2 fingers, lifted it where all could see it, and opened it. It was a 100-ruble note, folded in 8. Pyotr Petrovitch held up the note, showing it to everyone. "Thief! Out of my lodging! Police! Police!" yelled Amalia Ivanovna. "They must to Siberia be sent! Away!" Exclamations arose on all sides. Raskolnikov was silent, keeping his eyes fixed on Sonia, except for an occasional rapid glance at Luzhin. Sonia stood still, as though unconscious. She was hardly able to feel surprise. Suddenly the color rushed to her cheeks. She uttered a cry and hid her face in her hands. "No, it wasn't I didn't take it. I know nothing about it," she cried with a heart-rending wail, and she ran to Katerina Ivanovna, who clasped her tightly in her arms, as though she would shelter her from all the world. Sonia, I don't believe it. You see, I don't believe it," she cried in the face of the obvious fact, swaying her to and fro in her arms like a baby, kissing her face continually, then snatching at her hands and kissing them too. "You took it! How stupid these people are! Oh, dear, you are fools, fools!" she cried, addressing the whole room. You don't know what a heart she has, what a girl she is. She take it, she? She'd sell her last rag. She'd go barefoot to help you if you needed it. That's what she is. She has the yellow passport because my children were starving. She sold herself for us. Ah, husband, do you see? What a memorial dinner for you! Merciful heavens! Defend her!
Why are you all standing still? Rodion Romanovitch, why don't you stand up for her? Do you believe it too? You are not worth her little finger, all of you together. Good God, defend her now, at least." The wail of the poor, consumptive, helpless woman seemed to produce a great effect on her audience. The agonized, wasted, consumptive face, the parched, blood-stained lips, the hoarse voice, the tears unrestrained as a child's, the trustful, childish, and yet despairing prayer for help were so piteous that everyone seemed to feel for her. Pyotr Petrovitch, at any rate, was at once moved to compassion. "Madam, madam, this incident does not reflect upon you," he cried impressively. "No one would take upon himself to accuse you of being an instigator or even an accomplice in it, especially as you have proved her guilt by turning out her pockets, showing that you had no previous idea of it. I am most ready to show compassion, if poverty, so to speak, drove Sofya Semyonovna to it. But why did you refuse to confess, mademoiselle? Were you afraid of the disgrace? The first step? You lost your head, perhaps? One can quite understand it. But how could you have lowered yourself to such an action? Gentlemen," he addressed the whole company, "gentlemen, compassionate and, so to say, commiserating these people, I am ready to overlook it even now in spite of the personal insult lavished upon me. And may this disgrace be a lesson to you for the future," he said, addressing Sonia. "And I will carry the matter no further. Enough." Pyotr Petrovitch stole a glance at Raskolnikov. Their eyes met, and the fire in Raskolnikov's seemed ready to reduce him to ashes. Meanwhile, Katerina Ivanovna apparently heard nothing. She was kissing and hugging Sonia like a madwoman. The children, too, were embracing Sonia on all sides, and Polenka, though she did not fully understand what was wrong, was drowned in tears and shaking with sobs as she hid her pretty little face, swollen with weeping, on Sonia's shoulder. "How vile!" a loud voice cried suddenly in the doorway. Pyotr Petrovitch looked round quickly. "What vileness?" Lebeziatnikov repeated, staring him straight in the face. Pyotr Petrovitch gave a positive start. All noticed it, and recalled it afterwards. Lebeziatnikov strode into the room. "And you dare to call me as a witness?" he said, going up to Pyotr Petrovitch. "What do you mean? What are you talking about?" muttered Luzhin. "I mean that you are a slanderer. That's what my words mean," Lebeziatnikov said hotly, looking sternly at him with his short-sighted eyes. He was extremely angry. Raskolnikov gazed intently at him, as though seizing and weighing each word. Again there was a silence. Pyotr Petrovitch indeed seemed almost dumbfounded for the first moment. "If you mean that for me," he began, stammering, "but what's the matter with you? Are you out of your mind?" "I'm in my mind, but you are a scoundrel." "Ah, how vile! I have heard everything. I kept waiting on purpose to understand it, for I must own even now it is not quite logical. What you have done it all for, I can't understand." "Why, what have I done, then? Give over talking your nonsensical riddles, or maybe you are drunk." "You may be a drunkard, perhaps, vile man, but I am not. I never touch vodka, for it's against my convictions. Would you believe it? He himself, with his own hands, gave Sofya Semyonovna that 100-ruble note. I saw it. I was a witness. I'll take my oath. He did it. He," repeated Lebeziatnikov, addressing all. "Are you crazy, milksop?" squealed Luzhin. "She is herself before you. She herself here declared just now before everyone that I gave her only 10 rubles. How could I have given it to her?" "I saw it. I saw it," Lebeziatnikov repeated. "And though it is against my principles, I am ready this very minute to take any oath you like before the court, for I saw how you slipped it in her pocket. Only, like a fool, I thought you did it out of kindness. When you were saying good-bye to her at the door, while you held her hand in one hand, with the other, the left, you slipped the note into her pocket. I saw it. I saw it." Luzhin turned pale. "What lies!" he cried impudently. "Why, how could you, standing by the window, see the note? You fancied it with your short-sighted eyes. You are raving." "No, I didn't fancy it. And though I was standing some way off, I saw it all. And though it certainly would be hard to distinguish a note from the window, that's true, I knew for certain that it was a 100-rouble note, because when you were going to give Sofya Semyonovna 10 roubles, you took up from the table a 100-rouble note. I saw it because I was standing near then, and an idea struck me at once, so that I did not forget you had it in your hand. You folded it and kept it in your hand all the time. I didn't think of it again until, when you were getting up, you changed it from your right hand to your left, and nearly dropped it. I noticed it because the same idea struck me again, that you meant to do her a kindness without my seeing. You can fancy how I watched you, and I saw how you succeeded in slipping it into her pocket. I saw it, I'll take my oath." Lebeziatnikov was almost breathless. Exclamations arose on all hands, chiefly expressive of wonder, but some were menacing in tone. They all crowded round Pyotr Petrovitch. Katerina Ivanovna flew to Lebeziatnikov. "I was mistaken in you. Protect her. You are the only one to take her part. She is an orphan. God has sent you." Katerina Ivanovna, hardly knowing what she was doing, sank on her knees before him. "A pack of nonsense!" yelled Luzhin, roused to fury. "It's all nonsense you've been talking. An idea struck you. You didn't think. You noticed. What does it amount to? So I gave it to her on the sly, on purpose? What for? With what object? What have I to do with this?" "What for? That's what I can't understand. But that what I am telling you is the fact, that's certain. So far from my being mistaken, you infamous criminal man, I remember how, on account of it, a question occurred to me at once, just when I was thanking you and pressing your hand. What made you put it secretly in her pocket? Why you did it secretly, I mean. Could it simply be to conceal it from me, knowing that my convictions are opposed to yours, and that I do not approve of private benevolence, which effects no radical cure? Well, I decided that you really were ashamed of giving such a large sum before me. Perhaps, too, I thought, he wants to give her a surprise, when she finds a whole 100-rouble note in her pocket. For I know some benevolent people are very fond of decking out their charitable actions in that way. Then the idea struck me, too, that you wanted to test her, to see whether, when she found it, she would come to thank you. Then, too, that you wanted to avoid thanks, and that, as the saying is, your right hand should not know— something of that sort, in fact. I thought of so many possibilities that I put off considering it, but still thought it indelicate to show you that I knew your secret. But another idea struck me again, that Sofya Semyonovna might easily lose the money before she noticed it. That was why I decided to come in here and call her out of the room and to tell her that you put 100 roubles in her pocket. But on my way I went first to Madame Kobilatnikov's to take them the general treatise on the positive method, and especially to recommend Pederet's article and also Wagner's. Then I come on here, and what a state of things I find! Now could I have all these ideas and reflections if I had not seen you put the 100-rouble note in her pocket?" When Lebeziatnikov finished his long-winded harangue, with the logical deduction at the end, he was quite tired, and the perspiration streamed from his face. He could not, alas, even express himself correctly in Russian, though he knew no other language, so that he was quite exhausted, almost emaciated after this heroic exploit. But his speech produced a powerful effect. He had spoken with such vehemence, with such conviction, that everyone obviously believed him. Pyotr Petrovitch felt that things were going badly with him. "What is it to do with me if silly ideas did occur to you?" he shouted. "That's no evidence. You may have dreamt it, that's all. And I tell you, you are lying, sir. You are lying and slandering from some spite against me, simply from pique, because I did not agree with your free-thinking, godless social propositions." But this retort did not benefit Pyotr Petrovitch. Murmurs of disapproval were heard on all sides. "Ah, "That's your line now, is it?" cried Lebeziatnikov. "That's nonsense. Call the police, and I'll take my oath. There's only one thing I can't understand. What made him risk such a contemptible action? Oh, pitiful, despicable man!" "I can explain why he risked such an action, and if necessary, I too will swear to it," Raskolnikov said at last in a firm voice, and he stepped forward. He appeared to be firm and composed. Everyone felt clearly, from the very look of him, that he really knew about it and that the mystery would be solved. "Now I can explain it all to myself," said Raskolnikov, addressing Lebeziatnikov. "From the very beginning of the business, I suspected that there was some scoundrelly intrigue at the bottom of it. I began to suspect it from some special circumstances known to me only, which I will explain at once to everyone. They account for everything. Your valuable evidence has finally made everything clear to me. I beg all to listen. This gentleman," he pointed to Luzhin, "was recently engaged to be married to a young lady, my sister, Avdotia Romanovna Raskolnikov. But coming to Petersburg, he quarrelled with me, the day before yesterday, at our first meeting, and I drove him out of my room. I have 2 witnesses to prove it. He is a very spiteful man. The day before yesterday I did not know that he was staying here in your room, and that consequently on the very day we quarrelled, the day before yesterday, he saw me give Katerina Ivanovna some money for the funeral, as a friend of the late Mr. Marmeladov. He at once wrote a note to my mother, and informed her that I had given away all my money, not to Katerina Ivanovna, but to Sofya Semyonovna, and referred in a most contemptible way to the character of Sofya Semyonovna, that is, hinted at the character of my attitude to Sofya Semyonovna. All this, you understand, was with the object of dividing me from my mother and sister, by insinuating that I was squandering on unworthy objects the money which they had sent me and which was all they had. Yesterday evening, before my mother and sister and in his presence, I declared that I had given the money to Katerina Ivanovna for the funeral, and not to Sofya Semyonovna, and that I had no acquaintance with Sofya Semyonovna, and had never seen her before indeed. At the same time I added that he, Pyotr Petrovitch Luzhin, with all his virtues, was not worth Sofya Semyonovna's little finger, though he spoke so ill of her. To his question, would I let Sofya Semyonovna sit down beside my sister, I answered that I had already done so that day. Irritated that my mother and sister were unwilling to quarrel with me at his insinuations, he gradually began being unpardonably rude to them. A final rupture took place, and he was turned out of the house. All this happened yesterday evening. Now I beg your special attention. Consider. If he had now succeeded in proving that Sofya Semyonovna was a thief, he would have shown to my mother and sister that he was almost right in his suspicions, that he had reason to be angry at my putting my sister on a level with Sofya Semyonovna, that in attacking me he was protecting and preserving the honor of my sister, his betrothed. In fact, he might even, through all this, have been able to estrange me from my family, and no doubt he hoped to be restored to favor with them, to say nothing of revenging himself on me personally, for he has grounds for supposing that the honor and happiness of Sofya Semyonovna are very precious to me. That was what he was working for. That's how I understand it. That's the whole reason for it, and there can be no other." It was like this, or somewhat like this, that Raskolnikov wound up his speech, which was followed very attentively, though often interrupted by exclamations from his audience. But in spite of interruptions he spoke clearly, calmly, exactly, firmly. His decisive voice, his tone of conviction, and his stern face made a great impression on everyone. "Yes, that's it," Lebeziatnikov assented gleefully. "That must be it, for he asked me, as soon as Sofya Semyonovna came into our room, whether you were here, whether I had seen you among Katerina Ivanovna's guests. He called me aside to the window and asked me in secret. It was essential for him that you should be here. That's it. Luzhin smiled contemptuously and did not speak, but he was very pale. He seemed to be deliberating on some means of escape.
Perhaps he would have been glad to give up everything and get away, but at the moment this was scarcely possible. It would have implied admitting the truth of the accusations brought against him. Moreover, the company, which had already been excited by drink, was now too much stirred to allow it. The commissariat clerk, though indeed he had not grasped the whole position, was shouting louder than anyone, and was making some suggestions very unpleasant to Lucian. But not all those present were drunk. Lodgers came in from all the rooms. The three Poles were tremendously excited, and were continually shouting at him, "The pan is a lajak," and muttering threats in Polish. Sonia had been listening with strained attention, though she too seemed unable to grasp it all. She seemed as though she had just returned to consciousness. She did not take her eyes off Raskolnikov, feeling that all her safety lay in him. Katerina Ivanovna breathed hard and painfully, and seemed fearfully exhausted. Amalia Ivanovna stood looking more stupid than anyone, with her mouth wide open, unable to make out what had happened. She only saw that Pyotr Petrovitch had somehow come to grief. Raskolnikov was attempting to speak again, but they did not let him. Everyone was crowding round Lucian with threats and shouts of abuse. But Pyotr Petrovitch was not intimidated. Seeing that his accusation of Sonia had completely failed, he had recourse to insolence. "Allow me, gentlemen, allow me! Don't squeeze me! Let me pass!" he said, making his way through the crowd. "And no threats, if you please. I assure you it will be useless. You will gain nothing by it. On the contrary, you'll have to answer, gentlemen, for violently obstructing the course of justice. The thief has been more than unmasked, and I shall prosecute. Our judges are not so blind and not so drunk, and will not believe the testimony of two notorious infidels, agitators, and atheists, who accuse me from motives of personal revenge which they are foolish enough to admit. Yes, allow me to pass. Don't let me find a trace of you in my room. Kindly leave at once, and everything is at an end between us. When I think of the trouble I've been taking, the way I've been expounding, all this fortnight— I told you myself today that I was going, when you tried to keep me. Now I will simply add that you are a fool. I advise you to see a doctor for your brains and your short sight. Let me pass, gentlemen." He forced his way through, but the commissariat clerk was unwilling to let him off so easily. He picked up a glass from the table, brandished it in the air, and flung it at Pyotr Petrovitch, but the glass flew straight at Amalia Ivanovna. She screamed, and the clerk, overbalancing, fell heavily under the table. Pyotr Petrovitch made his way to his room, and half an hour later had left the house. Sonia, timid by nature, had felt before that day that she could be ill-treated more easily than anyone, and that she could be wronged with impunity. Yet till that moment she had fancied that she might escape misfortune by care, gentleness, and submissiveness before everyone. Her disappointment was too great. She could, of course, bear with patience and almost without murmur anything, even this. But for the first minute she felt it too bitter. In spite of her triumph and her justification, when her first terror and stupefaction had passed and she could understand it all clearly, the feeling of her helplessness and of the wrong done to her made her heart throb with anguish, and she was overcome with hysterical weeping. At last, unable to bear any more, she rushed out of the room and ran home, almost immediately after Lucian's departure. When, amidst loud laughter, the glass flew at Amalia Ivanovna, it was more than the landlady could endure. With a shriek she rushed like a fury at Katerina Ivanovna, considering her to blame for everything. "Out of my lodgings! At once! Quick, march!" And with these words she began snatching up everything she could lay her hands on that belonged to Katerina Ivanovna, and throwing it on the floor. Katerina Ivanovna, pale, almost fainting, and gasping for breath, jumped up from the bed where she had sunk in exhaustion and darted at Amalia Ivanovna. But the battle was too unequal. The landlady waved her away like a feather. "What? As though that godless calumny was not enough, this vile creature attacks me. What? On the day of my husband's funeral I am turned out of my lodging. After eating my bread and salt, she turns me into the street with my orphans. Where am I to go?" wailed the poor woman, sobbing and gasping. "Good God!"
she cried with flashing eyes. "Is there no justice upon earth? Whom should you protect if not us orphans? We shall see. There is law and justice on earth. There is, I will find it. Wait a bit, godless creature. Polenka, stay with the children. I'll come back. Wait for me, if you have to wait in the street. We will see whether there is justice on earth." And throwing over her head that green shawl which Marmeladov had mentioned to Raskolnikov, Katerina Ivanovna squeezed her way through the disorderly and drunken crowd of lodgers who still filled the room, and, wailing and tearful, she ran into the street, with a vague intention of going at once somewhere to find justice. Polenka, with the two little ones in her arms, crouched terrified on the trunk in the corner of the room, where she waited trembling for her mother to come back. Amalia Ivanovna raged about the room, shrieking, lamenting, and throwing everything she came across on the floor. The lodgers talked incoherently. Some commented to the best of their ability on what had happened. Others quarreled and swore at one another, while others struck up a song. "Now it's time for me to go," thought Raskolnikov. "Well, Sofya Semyonovna, we shall see what you'll say now." And he set off in the direction of Sonia's lodgings. End of Part 5, Chapter 3. Part 5, Chapter 4. Raskolnikov had been a vigorous and active champion of Sonia against Luzhin, although he had such a load of horror and anguish in his own heart. But having gone through so much in the morning, he found a sort of relief in a change of sensations, apart from the strong personal feeling which impelled him to defend Sonia. He was agitated, too, especially at some moments, by the thought of his approaching interview with Sonia. He had to tell her who had killed Lizaveta. He knew the terrible suffering it would be to him, and, as it were, brushed away the thought of it. So when he cried as he left Katerina Ivanovna's, "Well, Sofya Semyonovna, we shall see what you'll say now," he was still superficially excited, still vigorous and defiant from his triumph over Luzhin. But, strange to say, by the time he reached Sonia's lodging, he felt a sudden impotence and fear. He stood still in hesitation at the door, asking himself the strange question, must he tell her who killed Lizaveta? It was a strange question because he felt at the very time not only that he could not help telling her, but also that he could not put off the telling. He did not know why it must be so, he only felt it. And the agonizing sense of his impotence before the inevitable almost crushed him. To cut short his hesitation and suffering, he quickly opened the door and looked at Sonia from the doorway. She was sitting with her elbows on the table and her face in her hands, but seeing Raskolnikov, she got up at once and came to meet him as though she were expecting him. "What would have become of me but for you?" she said quickly, meeting him in the middle of the room. Evidently she was in haste to say this to him. It was what she had been waiting for. Raskolnikov went to the table and sat down on the chair, from which she had only just risen. She stood facing him 2 steps away, just as he had done the day before. "Well, Sonia," he said, and felt that his voice was trembling. "It was all due to your social position and the habits associated with it. Did you understand that just now?" Her face showed her distress. "Only don't talk to me as you did yesterday," she interrupted him. "Please don't begin it. There is misery enough without that." She made haste to smile, afraid that he might not like the reproach. "I was silly to come away from there. What is happening there now? I wanted to go back directly, but I kept thinking that you would come." He told her that Amalia Ivanovna was turning them out of their lodging, and that Katerina Ivanovna had run off somewhere to seek justice. "My God!" cried Sonia. "Let's go at once." And she snatched up her cape. "It's everlastingly the same thing," said Raskolnikov irritably. "You've no thought except for them. Stay a little with me." "But Katerina Ivanovna—" "You won't lose Katerina Ivanovna, you may be sure. She'll come to you herself since she has run out," he added peevishly. "If she doesn't find you here, you'll be blamed for it." Sonia sat down in painful suspense.
Raskolnikov was silent, gazing at the floor and deliberating. "This time Luzhin did not want to prosecute you," he began, not looking at Sonia. "But if he wanted to, if it had suited his plans, he would have sent you to prison if it had not been for Lebeziatnikov and me, ah?" "Yes," she assented in a faint voice. "Yes," she repeated, preoccupied and distressed. "But I might easily not have been there. And it was quite an accident, Lebeziatnikov turning up." Sonia was silent. "And if you'd gone to prison, what then? Do you remember what I said yesterday?" Again she did not answer. He waited. "I thought you would cry out again, 'Don't speak of it, leave off.'" Raskolnikov gave a laugh, but a rather forced one. "What, silence again?" he asked a minute later. "We must talk about something, you know. It would be interesting for me to know how you would decide a certain problem, as Lebeziatnikov would say." He was beginning to lose the thread. "No, really, I am serious. Imagine, Sonia, that you had known all Luzhin's intentions beforehand. Known, that is, for a fact, that they would be the ruin of Katerina Ivanovna and the children, and yourself thrown in, since you don't count yourself for anything, Polenka too, for she'll go the same way. Well, if suddenly it all depended on your decision whether he or they should go on living, that is, whether Luzhin should go on living and doing wicked things, or Katerina Ivanovna should die, how would you decide which of them was to die? I ask you." Sonia looked uneasily at him. There was something peculiar in his hesitating question, which seemed approaching something in a roundabout way. "I felt that you were going to ask some question like that," she said, looking inquisitively at him. "I dare say you did. But how is it to be answered?" "Why do you ask about what could not happen?" said Sonia reluctantly. "Then it would be better for Luzhin to go on living and doing wicked things? You haven't dared to decide even that." "But I can't know the divine providence, and why do you ask what can't be answered? What's the use of such foolish questions? How could it happen that it should depend on my decision? Who has made me a judge to decide who is to live and who is not to live?" "Oh, if the divine providence is to be mixed up in it, there is no doing anything," Raskolnikov grumbled morosely. "You'd better say straight out what you want," Sonia cried in distress. "You are leading up to something again. Can you have come simply to torture me?" She could not control herself, and began crying bitterly. He looked at her in gloomy misery. 5 minutes passed. "Of course, you're right, Sonia," he said softly at last. He was suddenly changed. His tone of assumed arrogance and helpless defiance was gone. Even his voice was suddenly weak. "I told you yesterday that I was not coming to ask forgiveness, and almost the first thing I've said is to ask forgiveness. I said that about Luzhin and Providence for my own sake. I was asking forgiveness, Sonia." He tried to smile, but there was something helpless and incomplete in his pale smile. He bowed his head and hid his face in his hands. And suddenly a strange, surprising sensation of a sort of bitter hatred for Sonia passed through his heart. As it were wondering and frightened of this sensation, he raised his head and looked intently at her. But he met her uneasy and painfully anxious eyes fixed on him. There was love in them. His hatred vanished like a phantom. It was not the real feeling. He had taken the one feeling for the other. It only meant that that minute had come. He hid his face in his hands again and bowed his head. Suddenly he turned pale, got up from his chair, looked at Sonia, and without uttering a word sat down mechanically on her bed. His sensations that moment were terribly like the moment when he had stood over the old woman with the axe in his hand, and felt that he must not lose another minute. "What's the matter?" asked Sonia, dreadfully frightened. He could not utter a word. This was not at all the way he had intended to tell, and he did not understand what was happening to him now. She went up to him softly, sat down on the bed beside him, and waited, not taking her eyes off him. Her heart throbbed and sank. It was unendurable. He turned his deadly pale face to her. His lips worked, helplessly struggling to utter something. A pang of terror passed through Sonia's heart. "What's the matter?" she repeated, drawing a little away from him. "Nothing, Sonia. Don't be frightened. It's nonsense." "It really is nonsense, if you think of it," he muttered, like a man in delirium. "Why have I come to torture you?" he added suddenly, looking at her. "Why, really? I keep asking myself that question, Sonia." He had perhaps been asking himself that question a quarter of an hour before, but now he spoke helplessly, hardly knowing what he said, and feeling a continual tremor all over. "Oh, how you are suffering!" she muttered in distress, looking intently at him. "It's all nonsense. Listen, Sonia." He suddenly smiled, a pale, helpless smile for 2 seconds. "You remember what I meant to tell you yesterday?" Sonia waited uneasily. "I said as I went away that perhaps I was saying goodbye forever, but that if I came today I would tell you who killed Lizaveta." She began trembling all over. "Well, here I've come to tell you." "Then you really meant it yesterday?" she whispered with difficulty. "How do you know?" she asked quickly, as though suddenly regaining her reason. Sonia's face grew paler and paler. She breathed painfully. "I know." She paused a minute. "Have they found him?" she asked timidly. "No." "Then how do you know about it?" she asked again, hardly audibly, and again after a minute's pause. He turned to her and looked very intently at her. "Guess," he said, with the same distorted, helpless smile. A shudder passed over her. "But why do you frighten me like this?" she said, smiling like a child. "I must be a great friend of his, since I know," Raskolnikov went on, still gazing into her face, as though he could not turn his eyes away. "He did not mean to kill that Lizaveta. He killed her accidentally. He meant to kill the old woman when she was alone, and he went there, and then Lizaveta came in. He killed her too." Another awful moment passed. Both still gazed at one another. "You can't guess, then?" he asked suddenly, feeling as though he were flinging himself down from a steeple. "No," whispered Sonia. "Take a good look." As soon as he had said this again, the same familiar sensation froze his heart. He looked at her, and all at once seemed to see in her face the face of Lizaveta. He remembered clearly the expression in Lizaveta's face when he approached her with the axe, and she stepped back to the wall, putting out her hand, with childish terror in her face, looking as little children do when they begin to be frightened of something, looking intently and uneasily at what frightens them, shrinking back and holding out their little hands on the point of crying. Almost the same thing happened now to Sonia. With the same helplessness and the same terror, she looked at him for a while, and, suddenly putting out her left hand, pressed her fingers faintly against his breast, and slowly began to get up from the bed, moving further from him and keeping her eyes fixed even more immovably on him. Her terror infected him. The same fear showed itself on his face. In the same way he stared at her, and almost with the same childish smile. "Have you guessed?" he whispered at last. "Good God!" broke in an awful wail from her bosom. She sank helplessly on the bed, with her face in the pillows, but a moment later she got up, moved quickly to him, seized both of his hands, and, gripping them tight in her thin fingers, began looking into his face again with the same intense stare. In this last desperate look, she tried to look into him and catch some last hope. But there was no hope. There was no doubt remaining. It was all true. Later on, indeed, when she recalled that moment, she thought it strange and wondered why she had seen at once that there was no doubt. She could have not said, for instance, that she had foreseen something of the sort, and yet now, as soon as he told her, she suddenly fancied that she had really foreseen this very thing. "Stop, Sonia, enough. Don't torture me," he begged her miserably. It was not at all like this he had thought of telling her, but this is how it happened. She jumped up, seeming not to know what she was doing, and, wringing her hands, walked into the middle of the room, but quickly went back and sat down again beside him, her shoulder almost touching his. All of a sudden she started as though she had been stabbed, uttered a cry, and fell on her knees before him. She did not know why. "What have you done? What have you done to yourself?" she said in despair, and jumping up, she flung herself on his neck, threw her arms around him, and held him tightly. Raskolnikov drew back and looked at her with a mournful smile. "You are a strange girl, Sonia. You kiss me and hug me when I tell you about that. You don't think what you are doing." "There is no one in the whole world now so unhappy as you," she cried in a frenzy, not hearing what he said, and she suddenly broke into violent hysterical weeping. A feeling long unfamiliar to him flooded his heart and softened it at once. He did not struggle against it. 2 tears started into his eyes and hung on his eyelashes. "Then you won't leave me, Sonia?" he said, looking at her almost with hope. "No, no, never, nowhere," cried Sonia. "I will follow you. I will follow you everywhere. Oh, my God! Oh, how miserable I am! Why didn't I know you before? Why didn't you come before? Oh, dear!" "Here I have come." "Yes, now. What's to be done now?" Together, she repeated, as it were, unconsciously, and she hugged him again. "I'll follow you to Siberia." He recoiled at this, and the same hostile, almost haughty smile came to his lips. "Perhaps I don't want to go to Siberia yet, Sonia," he said. Sonia looked at him quickly. Again, after her first passionate, agonizing sympathy for the unhappy man, the terrible idea of the murder overwhelmed her. In his changed tone she seemed to hear the murderer speaking. She looked at him bewildered. She knew nothing as yet, why, how, with what object it had been. Now all these questions rushed at once into her mind, and again she could not believe it. He is a murderer. Could it be true? "What is the meaning of it? Where am I?" she said in complete bewilderment, as though still unable to recover herself. "How could you, a man like you, how could you bring yourself to it? What does it mean?" "Oh, well, to plunder. Leave off, Sonia," he answered wearily, almost with vexation. Sonia stood as though struck dumb, but suddenly she cried, "You were hungry. It was to help your mother, yes?" "No, Sonia, no," he muttered, turning away and hanging his head. "I was not so hungry. I certainly did not want to help my mother, but that's not the real thing either. Don't torture me, Sonia." Sonia clasped her hands. Could it all be true? Good God, what a truth! Who could believe it? And how could you give away your last farthing and yet rob and murder? "Ah," she cried suddenly, "that money you gave Katerina Ivanovna, that money, can that money—" "No, Sonia," he broke in hurriedly, "that money was not it. Don't worry yourself. That money my mother sent me, and it came when I was ill, the day I gave it to you. Razumihin saw it. He received it for me. That money was mine, my own." Sonia listened to him in bewilderment, and did her utmost to comprehend. "And that money, I don't even know really whether there was any money," he added softly, as though reflecting.
I took a purse off her neck, made of chamois leather, a purse stuffed full of something, but I didn't look in it. I suppose I hadn't time, and the things, chains and trinkets, I buried under a stone with the purse next morning in a yard off the V Prospect. They are all there now." Sonia strained every nerve to listen. "Then why, you said you did it to rob, but you took nothing?" she asked quickly, catching at a straw. "I don't know. I haven't yet decided whether to take that money or not," he said, musing again, and, seeming to wake up with a start, he gave a brief, ironical smile. "Ah, what silly stuff I am talking, eh?" The thought flashed through Sonia's mind, wasn't he mad? But she dismissed it at once. No, it was something else. She could make nothing of it, nothing. "Do you know, Sonia," he said suddenly with conviction, "let me tell you, if I'd simply killed because I was hungry," laying stress on every word and looking enigmatically but sincerely at her, "I should be happy now. You must believe that. What would it matter to you," he cried a moment later with a sort of despair, "what would it matter to you if I were to confess that I did wrong? What do you gain by such a stupid triumph over me? Ah, Sonia, was it for that I've come to you today?" Again Sonia tried to say something, but did not speak. "I asked you to go with me yesterday because you are all I have left." "Go where?" asked Sonia timidly. "Not to steal and not to murder. Don't be anxious." He smiled bitterly. "We are so different. And you know, Sonia, it's only now, only this moment, that I understand where I asked you to go with me yesterday. Yesterday, when I said it, I did not know where. I asked you for one thing. I came to you for one thing, not to leave me. You won't leave me, Sonia?" She squeezed his hand. "And why did I tell her? Why did I let her know?" he cried a minute later in despair, looking with infinite anguish at her. "Here you expect an explanation from me, Sonia. You are sitting and waiting for it, I see that. But what can I tell you? You won't understand, and will only suffer, on my account. Well, you are crying and embracing me again. Why do you do it? Because I couldn't bear my burden and have come to throw it on another? You suffer too, and I shall feel better. And can you love such a mean wretch?" "But aren't you suffering too?" cried Sonia. Again a wave of the same feeling surged into his heart, and again for an instant softened it. "Sonia, I have a bad heart. Take note of that. It may explain a great deal. I have come because I am bad. There are men who wouldn't have come. But I am a coward and a mean wretch. But never mind, that's not the point. I must speak now, but I don't know how to begin." He paused and sank into thought. "Ah, we are so different," he cried again. "We are not alike. And why did I come? I shall never forgive myself that." "No, no, it is a good thing you came," cried Sonia. "It's better I should know, far better." He looked at her with anguish. "What if it really were that?" he said, as though reaching a conclusion. "Yes, that's what it was. I wanted to become a Napoleon. That's why I killed her. Do you understand now?" "No," Sonia whispered naively and timidly. "Only speak, speak. I shall understand. I shall understand it in myself," she kept begging him. "You'll understand? Very well, we shall see." He paused, and was for some time lost in meditation. "It was like this. I asked myself one day this question. What if Napoleon, for instance, had happened to be in my place, and if he had not had Toulon, or Egypt, nor the passage of Mont Blanc to begin his career with, but instead of all those picturesque and monumental things, There had simply been some ridiculous old hag, a pawnbroker, who had to be murdered too to get money from her trunk, for his career, you understand. Well, would he have brought himself to that if there had been no other means? Wouldn't he have felt a pang at its being so far from monumental, and sinful too? Well, I must tell you that I worried myself fearfully over that question, so that I was awfully ashamed when I guessed at last, all of a sudden, somehow, that it would not have given him the least pang, that it would not even have struck him that it was not monumental, that he would not have seen that there was anything in it to pause over, and that, if he had had no other way, he would have strangled her in a minute without thinking about it. Well, I, too, left off thinking about it, murdered her, following his example. And that's exactly how it was. Do you think it funny? Yes, Sonia, the funniest thing of all is that perhaps that's just how it was.
Sonia did not think it at all funny.
You had better tell me straight out, without examples, she begged, still more timidly and scarcely audible. He turned to her, looked sadly at her, and took her hands. You are right again, Sonia. Of course, that's all nonsense. It's almost all talk. You see, you know, of course, that my mother has scarcely anything. My sister happened to have a good education and was condemned to drudge as a governess. All their hopes were centered on me. I was a student, but I couldn't keep myself at the university, and was forced for a time to leave it. Even if I lingered on like that, in 10 or 12 years, I might, with luck, hope to be some sort of teacher or clerk with a salary of 1,000 rubles. He repeated it as though it were a lesson. And by that time my mother would have been worn out with grief and anxiety, and I could not succeed in keeping her in comfort, while my sister might well have fared worse. And it's a hard thing to pass everything by all one's life, to turn one's back upon everything, to forget one's mother and decorously accept the insults inflicted on one's sister. Why should one? When one has buried them to burden oneself with others, wife and children, and to leave them again without a farthing. So I resolved to gain possession of the old woman's money, and to use it for my first years without worrying my mother, to keep myself at the university, and for a little while after leaving it, and to do this all on a broad, thorough scale, so as to build up a completely new career and enter upon a new life of independence. Well, that's all. Well, of course, in killing the old woman I did wrong. Well, that's enough. He struggled to the end of his speech in exhaustion and let his head sink. "Oh, that's not it. That's not it," Sonia cried in distress. "How could one— No, that's not right. Not right." "You see yourself that it's not right. But I've spoken truly. It's the truth." "As though that could be the truth. Good God!" "I've only killed a louse, Sonia. A useless, loathsome, harmful creature." "A human being? A louse?" "I, too, know it wasn't a louse," he answered, looking strangely at her. "But I am talking nonsense, Sonia," he added. "I've been talking nonsense a long time. That's not it. You are right there. There were quite other causes for it. I haven't talked to anyone for so long, Sonia. My head aches dreadfully now." His eyes shone with feverish brilliance. He was almost delirious. An uneasy smile strayed on his lips. His terrible exhaustion could be seen through his excitement. Sonia saw how he was suffering. She, too, was growing dizzy. And he talked so strangely. It seemed somehow comprehensible, but yet— "But how? How? Good God!" And she wrung her hands in despair. "No, Sonia, that's not it," he began again suddenly, raising his head, as though a new and sudden train of thought had struck and as it were roused him. "That's not it. Better imagine— Yes, it's certainly better. Imagine that I am vain, envious, malicious, base, vindictive, and, well, perhaps with a tendency to insanity. Let's have it all out at once. They've talked of madness already, I noticed. I told you just now I could not keep myself at the university. But do you know that perhaps I might have done? My mother would have sent me what I needed for the fees, and I could have earned enough for clothes, boots, and food, no doubt. Lessons had turned up at half a rouble. Razumian works. But I turned sulky and wouldn't. Yes, sulkiness, that's the right word for it. I sat in my room like a spider. You've been in my den. You've seen it. And do you know, Sonia, that low ceilings and tiny rooms cramp the soul and the mind? Ah, how I hated that garret. And yet I wouldn't go out of it. I wouldn't on purpose. I didn't go out for days together, and I wouldn't work. I wouldn't even eat. I just lay there doing nothing. If Nastasia brought me anything, I ate it. If she didn't, I went all day without. I wouldn't ask on purpose, from sulkiness. At night I had no light. I lay in the dark, and I wouldn't earn money for candles. I ought to have studied, but I sold my books, and the dust lies an inch thick on the notebooks on my table. I preferred lying still and thinking. And I kept thinking. And I had dreams all the time, strange dreams of all sorts, no need to describe. Only then I began to fancy that— No, that's not it. Again, I'm telling you wrong. You see, I kept asking myself then, why am I so stupid that if others are stupid, and I know they are, yet I won't be wiser? Then I saw, Sonia, that if one waits for everyone to get wiser, it will take too long. Afterwards, I understood that that would never come to pass, that men won't change, and that nobody can alter it, and that it's not worth wasting effort over it. Yes, that's so. That's the law of their nature, Sonia. That's so. And I know now, Sonia, that whoever is strong in mind and spirit will have power over them. Anyone who is greatly daring is right in their eyes. He who despises most things will be a lawgiver among them, and he who dares most of all will be most in the right. So it has been till now, and so it will always be. A man must be blind not to see it. Though Raskolnikov looked at Sonia as he said this, he no longer cared whether she understood or not. The fever had complete hold of him. He was in a sort of gloomy ecstasy. He certainly had been too long without talking to anyone. Sonia felt that his gloomy creed had become his faith and code. "I divined then, Sonia," he went on eagerly, "that power is only vouchsafed to the man who dares to stoop and pick it up. There is only one thing needful. One has only to dare." Then, for the first time in my life, an idea took shape in my mind which no one had ever thought of before me, no one. I saw clear as daylight how strange it is that not a single person living in this mad world has had the daring to go straight for it all and send it flying to the devil. I wanted to have the daring, and I killed her. I only wanted to have the daring, Sonia. That was the whole cause of it." "Oh, hush, hush!" cried Sonia, clasping her hands. "You turned away from God, and God has smitten you, has given you over to the devil." "Then, Sonia, when I used to lie there in the dark and all this became clear to me, was it a temptation of the devil, eh?" "Hush! Don't laugh, blasphemer! You don't understand! You don't understand! Oh, God, he won't understand!" "Hush, Sonia! I am not laughing. I know myself that it was the devil leading me. Hush, Sonia, hush!" he repeated with gloomy insistence. "I know it all. I have thought it all over and whispered it all over to myself, lying there in the dark. I have argued it all over with myself, every point of it, and I know it all. And how sick I was then of going over it all. I have kept wanting to forget it and make a new beginning, Sonia, and leave off thinking. And don't you suppose that I went into it headlong like a fool? I went into it like a wise man, and that was just my destruction. And you mustn't suppose that I didn't know, for instance, that if I began to question myself whether I had the right to gain power, I certainly hadn't the right, or that if I asked myself whether a human being is a louse, it proved that it wasn't so for me, though it might be for a man who would go straight to his goal without asking questions. If I worried myself all those days, wondering whether Napoleon would have done it or not, I felt clearly, of course, that I wasn't Napoleon. I had to endure all the agony of that battle of ideas, Sonia, and I longed to throw it off. I wanted to murder without casuistry, to murder for my own sake, for myself alone. I didn't want to lie about it even to myself. It wasn't to help my mother I did the murder. That's nonsense. I didn't do the murder to gain wealth and power and to become a benefactor of mankind. Nonsense. I simply did it. I did the murder for myself alone, and whether I became a benefactor to others or spent my life like a spider catching men in my web and sucking the life out of men, I couldn't have cared at that moment. And it was not the money I wanted, Sonia, when I did it. It was not so much the money I wanted, but something else. I know it all now. Understand me. Perhaps I should never have committed a murder again. I wanted to find out something else. It was something else led me on. I wanted to find out then and quickly whether I was a louse like everybody else or a man, whether I can step over barriers or not, whether I dare stoop to pick it up or not, whether I am a trembling creature or whether I have the right— To kill? Have the right to kill? Sonia clasped her hands. "Ah, Sonia!" he cried irritably, and seemed about to make some retort, but was contemptuously silent. "Don't interrupt me, Sonia. I want to prove one thing only, that the devil led me on then, and he has shown me since that I had not the right to take that path, because I am just such a louse as all the rest. He was mocking me, and here I've come to you now. Welcome your guest. If I were not a louse, should I have come to you? Listen, when I went then to the old woman's, I only went to try. You may be sure of that." "And you murdered her." "But how did I murder her? Is that how men do murders? Do men go to commit a murder as I went then? I will tell you some day how I went. Did I murder the old woman? I murdered myself, not her. I crushed myself once for all, forever. But it was the devil that killed that old woman, not I. Enough, enough, Sonia, enough. Let me be," he cried in a sudden spasm of agony. "Let me be." He leaned his elbows on his knees and squeezed his head in his hands as in a vice. "What suffering!" A wail of anguish broke from Sonia. "Well, what am I to do now?" he asked, suddenly raising his head and looking at her with a face hideously distorted by despair. "What are you to do?" she cried, jumping up, and her eyes that had been full of tears suddenly began to shine. "Stand up!" She seized him by the shoulder. He got up, looking at her almost bewildered. "Go at once, this very minute. Stand at the crossroads. Bow down. First kiss the earth which you have defiled, and then bow down to all the world and say to all men aloud, 'I am a murderer.' Then God will send you life again. Will you go? Will you go?" she asked him, trembling all over, snatching his two hands, squeezing them tight in hers, and gazing at him with eyes full of fire. He was amazed at her sudden ecstasy. "You mean Siberia, Sonia? I must give myself up?" he asked gloomily. "Suffer and expiate your sin by it, that's what you must do." "No, I am not going to them, Sonia." "But how will you go on living? What will you live for?" cried Sonia. "How is it possible now? Why, how can you talk to your mother? Oh, what will become of them now? But what am I saying? You have abandoned your mother and your sister already. He has abandoned them already. Oh, God!" she cried. "Why, he knows it all himself. How can he live by himself? What will become of you now?" "Don't be a child, Sonia," he said softly. "What wrong have I done them? Why should I go to them? What should I say to them? That's only a phantom. They destroy men by millions themselves, and look on it as a virtue. They're knaves and scoundrels, Sonia. I am not going to them. And what should I say to them? That I murdered her, but did not dare to take the money, and hid it under a stone?" he added with a bitter smile. "Why, they would laugh at me, and they would call me a fool for not getting it. A coward and a fool. They wouldn't understand, and they don't deserve to understand. Why should I go to them? I won't. Don't be a child, Sonia." "It will be too much for you to bear, too much," she repeated, holding out her hands in despairing supplication. "Perhaps I've been unfair to myself," he observed gloomily, pondering. "Perhaps, after all, I am a man, and not a louse, and I've been in too great a hurry to condemn myself. I'll make another fight for it." A haughty smile appeared on his lips. "What a burden to bear! And your whole life, your whole life!" "I shall get used to it," he said grimly and thoughtfully. "Listen," he began a minute later. "Stop crying. It's time to talk of the facts. I've come to tell you that the police are after me, on my track." "Ah!" Sonia cried in terror. "Well, why do you cry out? You want me to go to Siberia, and now you are frightened? But let me tell you, I shall not give myself up. I shall make a struggle for it, and they won't do anything to me. They've no real evidence. Yesterday I was in great danger, and believed I was lost. But today things are going better. All the facts they know can be explained two ways. That's to say, I can turn their accusations to my credit. Do you understand? And I shall, for I've learnt my lesson. But they will certainly arrest me. If it had not been for something that happened, they would have done so today for certain. Perhaps even now they will arrest me today. But that's no matter, Sonia. They'll let me out again, for there isn't any real proof against me, and there won't be. I give you my word for it. And they can't convict a man on what they have against me. Enough. I only tell you that you may know. I will try to manage somehow to put it to my mother and sister so that they won't be frightened. My sister's future is secure, however, now, I believe, and my mother's must be too. Well, that's all. Be careful, though. Will you come and see me in prison when I am there? Oh, I will, I will. They sat side by side, both mournful and dejected, as though they had been cast up by the tempest alone on some deserted shore. He looked at Sonia and felt how great was her love for him, and strange to say, he felt it suddenly burdensome and painful to be so loved. Yes, it was a strange and awful sensation. On his way to see Sonia, he had felt that all his hopes rested on her. He expected to be rid of at least part of his suffering, and now, when all her heart turned towards him, he suddenly felt he was immeasurably unhappier than before. "Sonia," he said, "you'd better not come and see me when I am in prison." Sonia did not answer. She was crying. Several minutes passed. "Have you a cross on you?" she asked, as though suddenly thinking of it. He did not at first understand the question. "No, of course not. Here, take this one, of cypress wood. I have another, a copper one, that belonged to Lizaveta. I changed with Lizaveta. She gave me her cross, and I gave her my little icon. I will wear Lizaveta's now, and give you this. Take it. It's mine. It's mine, you know," she begged him. "We will go to suffer together, and together we will bear our cross." "Give it me," said Raskolnikov. He did not want to hurt her feelings, but immediately he drew back the hand he held out for the cross. "Not now, Sonia. Better later," he added to comfort her. "Yes, yes, better," she repeated with conviction. "When you go to meet your suffering, then put it on. You will come to me, I'll put it on you, we will pray and go together." At that moment someone knocked 3 times at the door. "Sofya Semyonovna, may I come in?" they heard in a very familiar and polite voice. Sonia rushed to the door in a fright. The flaxen head of Mr. Lebeziatnikov appeared at the door.
End of Part 5, Chapter 4. Part 5, Chapter 5. Lebeziatnikov looked perturbed. "I've come to you, Sofya Semyonovna," he began. "Excuse me, I thought I should find you," he said, addressing Raskolnikov suddenly. "That is, I didn't mean anything of that sort, but I just thought— Katerina Ivanovna has gone out of her mind," he blurted out suddenly, turning from Raskolnikov to Sonia. Sonia screamed. "At least it seems so, but we don't know what to do, you see. She came back. She seems to have been turned out somewhere, perhaps beaten, so it seems at least. She had run to your father's former chief. She didn't find him at home. He was dining at some other general's. Only fancy, she rushed off there to the other general's, and imagine, she was so persistent that she managed to get the chief to see her, had him fetched out from dinner, it seems. You can imagine what happened. She was turned out, of course, but, according to her own story, she abused him and threw something at him. One may well believe it. How it is she wasn't taken up, I can't understand. Now she is telling everyone, including Amalia Ivanovna. But it's difficult to understand her. She is screaming and flinging herself about. Oh yes, she shouts that since everyone has abandoned her, she will take the children and go into the street with a barrel organ, and the children will sing and dance, and she too, and collect money, and will go every day under the general's window, to let everyone see well-born children, whose father was an official, begging in the street. She keeps beating the children, and they are all crying. She is teaching Lida to sing My Village, the boy to dance, Polenka the same. She is tearing up all the clothes, and making them little caps like actors. She means to carry a tin basin and make it tinkle, instead of music. She won't listen to anything. Imagine the state of things. It's beyond anything." Lebeziatnikov would have gone on, but Sonia, who had heard him almost breathless, snatched up her cloak and hat and ran out of the room, putting on her things as she went. Raskolnikov followed her, and Lebeziatnikov came after him. "She has certainly gone mad," he said to Raskolnikov as they went out into the street. "I didn't want to frighten Sofya Semyonovna, so I said it seemed like, but there isn't a doubt of it. They say that in consumption the tubercles sometimes occur in the brain. It's a pity I know nothing of medicine. I did try to persuade her, but she wouldn't listen." "Did you talk to her about the tubercles?" "Not precisely of the tubercles. Besides, she wouldn't have understood. But what I say is, that if you convince a person logically that he has nothing to cry about, he'll stop crying. That's clear. Is it your conviction that he won't?" "Life would be too easy if it were so," answered Raskolnikov. Excuse me. Of course it would be rather difficult for Katerina Ivanovna to understand, but do you know that in Paris they have been conducting serious experiments as to the possibility of curing the insane simply by logical argument? One professor there, a scientific man of standing, lately dead, believed in the possibility of such treatment. His idea was that there's really nothing wrong with the physical organism of the insane, and that insanity is, so to speak, a logical mistake, an error of judgment, an incorrect view of things. He gradually showed the madman his error, and, would you believe it, they say he was successful? But as he made use of douches too, how far success was due to that treatment remains uncertain. So it seems, at least." Raskolnikov had long ceased to listen. Reaching the house where he lived, he nodded to Lebeziatnikov and went in at the gate. Lebeziatnikov woke up with a start, looked about him, and hurried on. Raskolnikov went into his little room and stood still in the middle of it. Why had he come back here? He looked at the yellow and tattered paper, at the dust, at his sofa. From the yard came a loud, continuous knocking. Someone seemed to be hammering. He went to the window, rose on tiptoe, and looked out into the yard for a long time with an air of absorbed attention. But the yard was empty, and he could not see who was hammering. In the house on the left, he saw some open windows. On the window-sills were pots of sickly-looking geraniums. Linen was hung out of the windows. He knew it all by heart. He turned away and sat down on the sofa. Never, never had he felt himself so fearfully alone. Yes, he felt once more that he would perhaps come to hate Sonia, now that he had made her more miserable. Why had he gone to her to beg for her tears? What need had he to poison her life? Oh, the meanness of it! "I will remain alone," he said resolutely, "and she shall not come to the prison." 5 minutes later he raised his head with a strange smile. That was a strange thought. Perhaps it really would be better in Siberia, he thought suddenly. He could not have said how long he sat there with vague thoughts surging through his mind. All at once the door opened and Donia came in. At first she stood still and looked at him from the doorway, just as he had done at Sonia. Then she came in and sat down in the same place as yesterday, on the chair facing him. He looked silently and almost vacantly at her. "Don't be angry, brother. I've only come for 1 minute," said Donia. Her face looked thoughtful, but not stern. Her eyes were bright and soft. He saw that she too had come to him with love. "Brother, now I know all. Dmitri Prokofitch has explained and told me everything. They are worrying and persecuting you through a stupid and contemptible suspicion. Dmitri Prokofitch told me that there is no danger, and that you are wrong in looking upon it with such horror. I don't think so, and I fully understand how indignant you must be, and that indignation may have a permanent effect on you. That's what I am afraid of. As for your cutting yourself off from us, I don't judge you, I don't venture to judge you, and forgive me for having blamed you for it. I feel that I, too, if I had so great a trouble, should keep away from everyone. I shall tell Mother nothing of this, but I shall talk about you continually, and shall tell her from you that you will come very soon. Don't worry about her, I will set her mind at rest, but don't you try her too much. Come once at least. Remember that she is your mother. And now I have come simply to say," Donia began to get up, "that if you should need me or should need all my life or anything, call me and I'll come. Goodbye." She turned abruptly and went towards the door. "Donia," Raskolnikov stopped her and went towards her. "That Razumian, Dmitri Prokofitch, is a very good fellow." Donia flushed slightly. "Well?" she asked, waiting a moment. "He is competent, hard-working, honest, and capable of real love." "Goodbye, Donia." Donia flushed crimson, then suddenly she took alarm. "But what does it mean, brother? Are we really parting forever, that you give such a parting message?" "Never mind. Goodbye." He turned away and walked to the window. She stood a moment, looked at him uneasily, and went out troubled. No, he was not cold to her. There was an instant, the very last one, when he had longed to take her in his arms and say goodbye to her, and even to tell her, but he had not dared even to touch her hand. "Afterwards she may shudder when she remembers that I embraced her, and will feel that I stole her kiss." "And would she stand that test?" he went on a few minutes later to himself. "No, she wouldn't. Girls like that can't stand things. They never do." And he thought of Sonia. There was a breath of fresh air from the window. The daylight was fading. He took up his cap and went out. He could not, of course, and would not consider how ill he was. But all this continual anxiety and agony of mind could not but affect him. And if he were not lying in high fever, it was perhaps just because his continual inner strain helped to keep him on his legs and in possession of his faculties. But this artificial excitement could not last long. He wandered aimlessly. The sun was setting. A special form of misery had begun to oppress him of late. There was nothing poignant, nothing acute about it, but there was a feeling of permanence, of eternity about it. It brought a foretaste of hopeless years of this cold, leaden misery, a foretaste of an eternity on a square yard of space. Towards evening this sensation usually began to weigh on him more heavily. With this idiotic, purely physical weakness, depending on the sunset or something, one can't help doing something stupid. You'll go to Donya, as well as to Sonia," he muttered bitterly. He heard his name called. He looked round. Lebeziatnikov rushed up to him. "Only fancy, I've been to your room looking for you. Only fancy, she's carried out her plan and taken away the children. Sofya Semyonovna and I have had a job to find them. She is rapping on a frying pan and making the children dance. The children are crying. They keep stopping at the crossroads and in front of shops. There's a crowd of fools running after them. Come along." "And Sonia?" Raskolnikov asked anxiously, hurrying after Lebeziatnikov. "Simply frantic. That is, it's not Sofya Semyonovna's frantic, but Katerina Ivanovna, though Sofya Semyonovna's frantic too. But Katerina Ivanovna is absolutely frantic. I tell you, she is quite mad. They'll be taken to the police. You can fancy what an effect that will have. They are on the canal bank, near the bridge now, not far from Sofya Semyonovna's, quite close." On the canal bank near the bridge, and not 2 houses away from the one where Sofya lodged, there was a crowd of people, consisting principally of gutter children. The hoarse, broken voice of Katerina Ivanovna could be heard from the bridge, and it certainly was a strange spectacle likely to attract a street crowd. Katerina Ivanovna, in her old dress with the green shawl, wearing a torn straw hat, crushed in a hideous way on one side, was really frantic. She was exhausted and breathless. Her wasted, consumptive face looked more suffering than ever, and indeed, out of doors in the sunshine, a consumptive always looks worse than at home. But her excitement did not flag, and every moment her irritation grew more intense. She rushed at the children, shouted at them, coaxed them, told them before the crowd how to dance and what to sing, began explaining to them why it was necessary, and driven to desperation by their not understanding, beat them. Then she would make a rush at the crowd. If she noticed any decently dressed person stopping to look, she immediately appealed to him to see what these children, from a genteel, one may say aristocratic house, had been brought to. If she heard laughter or jeering in the crowd, she would rush at once at the scoffers and begin squabbling with them. Some people laughed, others shook their heads, but everyone felt curious at the sight of the madwoman with the frightened children. The frying pan of which Lebeziatnikov had spoken was not there, at least Raskolnikov did not see it. But instead of rapping on the pan, Katerina Ivanovna began clapping her wasted hands, when she made Lida and Kolya dance and Polenka sing. She too joined in the singing, but broke down at the second note with a fearful cough, which made her curse in despair and even shed tears. What made her most furious was the weeping and terror of Kolya and Lida. Some effort had been made to dress the children up as street singers are dressed. The boy had on a turban made of something red and white to look like a Turk. There had been no costume for Lida. She simply had a red knitted cap, or rather a nightcap that had belonged to Marmeladov, decorated with a broken piece of white ostrich feather, which had been Katerina Ivanovna's grandmother's and had been preserved as a family possession. Polenka was in her everyday dress. She looked in timid perplexity at her mother, and kept at her side, hiding her tears. She dimly realized her mother's condition, and looked uneasily about her. She was terribly frightened of the street and the crowd. Sonia followed Katerina Ivanovna, weeping and beseeching her to return home, but Katerina Ivanovna was not to be persuaded. "Leave off, Sonia, leave off," she shouted, speaking fast, panting and coughing. "You don't know what you ask. You are like a child. I've told you before that I am not coming back to that drunken German. Let everyone, let all Petersburg see the children begging in the streets, though their father was an honorable man who served all his life in truth and fidelity, and one may say died in the service." Katerina Ivanovna had by now invented this fantastic story and thoroughly believed it. "Let that wretch of a general see it. You are silly, Sonia. What have we to eat? Tell me that. We have worried you enough. I won't go on so. Ah, Rodion Romanovitch, is that you?" she cried, seeing Raskolnikov and rushing up to him. "Explain to this silly girl, please, that nothing better could be done.
Even organ-grinders earn their living, and everyone will see at once that we are different, that we are an honorable and bereaved family reduced to beggary. And that general will lose his post, you'll see. We shall perform under his windows every day, and if the Tsar drives by, I'll fall on my knees, put the children before me, show them to him, and say, 'Defend us, Father.' He is the father of the fatherless. He is merciful. He'll protect us, you'll see. And that wretch of a general. Lida, tenez-vous droit. Kolya, you'll dance again. Why are you whimpering? Whimpering again. What are you afraid of, stupid? Goodness, what am I to do with them, Rodion Romanovitch? If you only knew how stupid they are. What's one to do with such children?"
And she, almost crying herself, which did not stop her uninterrupted, rapid flow of talk, pointed to the crying children. Raskolnikov tried to persuade her to go home, and even said, hoping to work on her vanity, that it was unseemly for her to be wandering about the streets like an organ-grinder, as she was intending to become the principal of a boarding school.
"A boarding school! Ha, ha, ha! A castle in the air!"
cried Katerina Ivanovna, her laugh ending in a cough.
"No, Rodion Romanovitch, that dream is over. All have forsaken us. And that general! You know, Rodion Romanovitch, I threw an ink-pot at him. It happened to be standing in the waiting-room by the paper where you sign your name. I wrote my name, threw it at him, and ran away. Oh, the scoundrels, the scoundrels! But enough of them. Now I'll provide for the children myself. I won't bow down to anybody. She has had to bear enough for us."
She pointed to Sonia.
"Polenka, how much have you got? Show me. What, only 2 farthings? Oh, the mean wretches! They give us nothing, only run after us, putting their tongues out. There, what is that blockhead laughing at?"
She pointed to a man in the crowd.
"It's all because Kolya here is so stupid. I have such a bother with him. What do you want, Polenka? Tell me in French, parlez-moi français. Why, I've taught you, you know some phrases. Else how are you to show that you are of good family, well-brought-up children, and not at all like other organ-grinders? We aren't going to have a Punch and Judy show in the street, but to sing a genteel song. Ah, yes, what are we to sing? You keep putting me out, but you see, we are standing here, Rodion Romanovitch, to find something to sing and get money, something Kolya can dance to. For, as you can fancy, our performance is all impromptu. We must talk it over and rehearse it all thoroughly, and then we shall go to Nevsky, where there are far more people of good society, and we shall be noticed at once. Lida knows my village only, nothing but my village, and everyone sings that. We must sing something far more genteel. Well, have you thought of anything, Polenka? If only you'd help your mother. My memory's quite gone, or I should have thought of something. We really can't sing An Hussar. Ah, let us sing in French Cinq Sous. I have taught it you, I have taught it you, and as it is in French, people will see at once that you are children of good family, and that will be much more touching. You might sing Marlborough s'en va-t-en-guerre, for that's quite a children's song, and is sung as a lullaby in all the aristocratic houses. Marlborough s'en va-t-en-guerre, ne sait quand reviendra, she began singing. But no, better sing Cinq Sous. Now, Kolya, your hands on your hips, make haste, and you, Lida, keep turning the other way, and Polenka and I will sing and clap our hands. Cinq sous, pour monter notre ménage. Cough, cough, cough. Set your dress straight, Polenka. It slipped down on your shoulders, she observed, panting from coughing. Now, it's particularly necessary to behave nicely and genteelly, that all may see that you are well-born children. I said at the time that the bodice should be cut longer and made of 2 widths. It was your fault, Sonia, with your advice to make it shorter, and now you see the child is quite deformed by it. Why, you're all crying again. What's the matter, stupids? Come, Kolya, begin. Make haste, make haste. Oh, what an unbearable child! "5 sous, 5 sous. A policeman again. What do you want?"
A policeman was indeed forcing his way through the crowd, but at that moment a gentleman in civilian uniform and an overcoat, a solid-looking official of about 50 with a decoration on his neck, which delighted Katerina Ivanovna and had its effect on the policeman, approached and without a word handed her a green 3-ruble note. His face wore a look of genuine sympathy. Katerina Ivanovna took it and gave him a polite, even ceremonious bow.
"I thank you, honored sir," she began loftily. "The causes that have induced us. Take the money, Polenka. You see, there are generous and honorable people who are ready to help a poor gentlewoman in distress. You see, honored sir, these orphans of good family, I might even say of aristocratic connections, and that wretch of a general sat eating grouse, and stamped at my disturbing him. 'Your Excellency,' I said, 'protect the orphans, for you knew my late husband, Semyon Zaharovitch, and on the very day of his death the basest of scoundrels slandered his only daughter. That policeman again! Protect me!' she cried to the official. 'Why is that policeman edging up to me? We have only just run away from one of them. What do you want, fool?'
'It's forbidden in the streets. You mustn't make a disturbance.'
'It's you're making a disturbance. It's just the same as if I were grinding an organ. What business is it of yours?'
'You have to get a license for an organ, and you haven't got one, and in that way you collect a crowd. Where do you lodge?'
'What? A license?' wailed Katerina Ivanovna. 'I buried my husband today. What need of a license?'
'Calm yourself, madam, calm yourself,' began the official. 'Come along. I will escort you. This is no place for you in the crowd. You are ill.'
'Honored sir, you don't know!' screamed Katerina Ivanovna. 'We are going to the Nevsky. Sonia, where is she? She is crying too. What's the matter with you all? Kolya, Lida, where are you going?' she cried suddenly in alarm. 'Oh, silly children! Kolya, Lida, where are they off to?'
Kolya and Lida, scared out of their wits by the crowd and their mother's mad pranks, suddenly seized each other by the hand and ran off at the sight of the policeman, who wanted to take them away somewhere. Weeping and wailing, poor Katerina Ivanovna ran after them. She was a piteous and unseemly spectacle as she ran, weeping and panting for breath. Sonia and Polenka rushed after them.
Bring them back, Sonia! Oh, stupid, ungrateful children! Polenka, catch them! It's for your sakes I—'
She stumbled as she ran and fell down.
'She's cut herself, she's bleeding. Oh, dear!' cried Sonia, bending over her.
All ran up and crowded around. Raskolnikov and Lebeziatnikov were the first at her side. The official, too, hastened up, and behind him the policeman, who muttered, "Bother," with a gesture of impatience, feeling that the job was going to be a troublesome one. Pass on," he said to the crowd that pressed forward. "She's dying," someone shouted. "She's gone out of her mind," said another.
"Lord, have mercy upon us," said a woman, crossing herself. "Have they caught the little girl and the boy? They're being brought back. The elder one's got them. Ah, the naughty imps!"
When they examined Katerina Ivanovna carefully, they saw that she had not cut herself against a stone, as Sonia thought, but that the blood that stained the pavement red was from her chest. "I've seen that before," muttered the official to Raskolnikov and Lebeziatnikov. "That's consumption. The blood flows and chokes the patient. I saw the same thing with a relative of my own not long ago. Nearly a pint of blood, all in a minute. What's to be done, though? She is dying."
This way, to my room," Sonia implored. "I live here. See, that house, the second from here. Come to me, make haste." She turned from one to the other. "Send for the doctor. Oh, dear."
Thanks to the official's efforts, this plan was adopted, the policeman even helping to carry Katerina Ivanovna. She was carried to Sonia's room, almost unconscious, and laid on the bed. The blood was still flowing, but she seemed to be coming to herself. Raskolnikov, Lebeziatnikov, and the official accompanied Sonia into the room and were followed by the policeman, who first drove back the crowd which followed to the very door. Polenka came in holding Kolya and Lida, who were trembling and weeping. Several persons came in too from the Kapernamovs' room. The landlord, a lame, one-eyed man of strange appearance, with whiskers and hair that stood up like a brush; his wife, a woman with an everlastingly scared expression, and several open-mouthed children with wonder-struck faces. Among these, Svidrigaïlov suddenly made his appearance. Raskolnikov looked at him with surprise, not understanding where he had come from and not having noticed him in the crowd. A doctor and priest were spoken of. The official whispered to Raskolnikov that he thought it was too late now for the doctor, but he ordered him to be sent for. Kapernaumov ran himself. Meanwhile, Katerina Ivanovna had regained her breath. The bleeding ceased for a time. She looked with sick but intent and penetrating eyes at Sonia, who stood pale and trembling, wiping the sweat from her brow with a handkerchief. At last she asked to be raised. They sat her up on the bed, supporting her on both sides.
"Where are the children?" she said in a faint voice. "You've brought them, Polenka? Oh, the sillies! Why did you run away? Ah!"
Once more her parched lips were covered with blood. She moved her eyes, looking about her.
"So that's how you live, Sonia. Never once have I been in your room."
She looked at her with a face of suffering.
"We have been your ruin, Sonia. Polenka, Lida, Kolya, come here. Well, here they are, Sonia. Take them all. I hand them over to you. I've had enough. The ball is over. Cough. Lay me down. Let me die in peace."
They laid her back on the pillow.
"What, the priest? I don't want him. You haven't got a rouble to spare. I have no sins. God must forgive me without that. He knows how I have suffered. And if he won't forgive me, I don't care."
She sank more and more into uneasy delirium. At times she shuddered, turned her eyes from side to side, recognized everyone for a minute, but at once sank into delirium again. Her breathing was hoarse and difficult. There was a sort of rattle in her throat.
"I said, to him, 'Your Excellency,'" she ejaculated, gasping after each word. "That Amalia Ludwigovna. Ah! Lida, Kolya, hands on your hips, make haste. Glissez, glissez, pas de basque. Tap with your heels, be graceful, child. Du hast Diamanten und Perlen. What next? That's the thing to sing. Du hast die schönsten Augenmachen, was willst du mehr? What an idea! Was willst du mehr? What things the fool invents! Ah, yes. In the heat of midday in the Vale of Dagestan. Ah, how I loved it! I loved that song to distraction, Polenka. Your father, you know, used to sing it when we were engaged. Oh, those days! Oh, that's the thing for us to sing. How does it go? I've forgotten. Remind me. How was it?"
She was violently excited and tried to sit up. At last, in a horribly hoarse, broken voice, she began, shrieking and gasping at every word, with a look of growing terror.
"In the heat of midday, in the Vale of Dagestan, with lead in my breast. Your Excellency," she wailed suddenly with a heart-rending scream and a flood of tears, "protect the orphans. You have been their father's guest, one may say aristocratic—"
She started, regaining consciousness, and gazed at all with a sort of terror, but at once recognized Sonia.
"Sonia, Sonia,"
she articulated softly and caressingly, as though surprised to find her there.
"Sonia, darling, are you here too?"
They lifted her up again.
"Enough! It's over! Farewell, poor thing! I am done for! I am broken!"
she cried with vindictive despair, and her head fell heavily back on the pillow. She sank into unconsciousness again, But this time it did not last long. Her pale, yellow, wasted face dropped back. Her mouth fell open. Her leg moved convulsively. She gave a deep, deep sigh and died. Sonia fell upon her, flung her arms about her, and remained motionless with her head pressed to the dead woman's wasted bosom. Polenka threw herself at her mother's feet, kissing them and weeping violently. Though Kolya and Lida did not understand what had happened, they had a feeling that it was something terrible. They put their hands on each other's little shoulders, stared straight at one another, and both at once opened their mouths and began screaming. They were both still in their fancy dress, one in a turban, the other in the cap with the ostrich feather. And how did the certificate of merit come to be on the bed beside Katerina Ivanovna? It lay there by the pillow. Raskolnikov saw it. He walked away to the window. Lebeziatnikov skipped up to him. "She is dead," he said. "Rodion Romanovitch, I must have 2 words with you," said Svidrigaïlov, coming up to them. Lebeziatnikov at once made room for him and delicately withdrew. Svidrigaïlov drew Raskolnikov further away. "I will undertake all the arrangements, the funeral and all that. You know it's a question of money, and, as I told you, I have plenty to spare. I will put those 2 little ones and Polenka into some good orphan asylum, and I will settle 1,500 roubles to be paid to each on coming of age, so that Sofya Semyonovna need have no anxiety about them. And I will pull her out of the mud too, for she is a good girl, isn't she? So tell Avdotya Romanovna that that is how I am spending her 10,000. "What is your motive for such benevolence?" asked Raskolnikov. "Ah, you skeptical person," laughed Svidrigaïlov. "I told you I had no need of that money. Won't you admit it's simply done from humanity? She wasn't a louse, you know." He pointed to the corner where the dead woman lay. "Was she, like some old pawnbroker woman? Come, you'll agree. Is Luzhin to go on living and doing wicked things, or is she to die? And if I didn't help them, Polenka would go the same way." He said this with an air of a sort of gay, winking slyness, keeping his eyes fixed on Raskolnikov, who turned white and cold, hearing his own phrases, spoken to Sonia. He quickly stepped back and looked wildly at Svidrigaïlov. "How do you know?" he whispered, hardly able to breathe. "Why, I lodge here at Madame Reslich's, the other side of the wall. Here is Kapernaumov, and there lives Madame Reslich, an old and devoted friend of mine. I am a neighbor." "You?" "Yes," continued Svidrigaïlov, shaking with laughter. "I assure you on my honor, dear Rodion Romanovitch, that you have interested me enormously. I told you we should become friends. I foretold it. Well, here we have. And you will see what an accommodating person I am. You will see that you can get on with me." End of Part 5, Chapter 5.